Hello everybody, my name is Mooney and this video is, well, it's exactly as the title says, a commentary on my favorite animated series, the Gridman universe. I don't want to spend too much time on the introduction because I suck at writing these, so instead we're going to keep things nice and simple. I'm going to explain the general contents and organization of this video, then throw down the spoiler warning before we begin the prologue for the first half. If you're not interested in any of that, then there should be timestamps down below in the description and probably any pinned comment as well that should allow you to skip right ahead to the prologue. To reiterate the title, this video is a commentary on my favorite animated series, the Gridman universe. At the time of this video, there are two animated installments that belong to the Gridman universe made as a collaboration between Trigger and Tsuburaya. The first is the anime that the universe takes its name from, SSSS.Gridman, which aired in the fall season of 2018. The second is the sequel SSSS.Dynazenon, which aired in the spring season of 2021. There are a lot of other installments within the series outside of these two, which mostly come in the form of written works, but those pieces will not be relevant to this video. This video won't be just a critique, review, analysis, or theory craft about the series because it's going to be a little bit of everything. Some sections of the video will be heavier on one over the other, but everything here will essentially be every single thought that has crossed my mind about the series at some point. This video isn't the first one I've made on the series. I made a video on just SSSS.Gridman previously in June of 2020, after having watched it in April. This video can sort of be considered a sequel to that one, since I'll be repeating a couple things from the original video because I will want to agree with, add onto, or disagree with my past self on a few topics. We can cleanly divide the video into two halves, one for each anime, with each half containing a series of chapters to further subdivide the video. The aforementioned timestamps will mark each and every one of these chapters, which should hopefully make both navigating through and watching in smaller pieces easier for those that are skeptical of videos of this size. I should also bring up that throughout this video I will be mentioning something along the lines of "we'll talk about this later" multiple times. I apologize in advance for this, but the stories in the series are very difficult to discuss in a concise manner with the way that this video is structured. Let's get on ahead with the spoiler warning then. This video will contain very extensive spoilers for both Gridman and Dynazenon. I love both of these animes and I absolutely cannot recommend them enough. My only parting words before we get into the main bulk of the video is that for anyone that has the preconceived notion that these are mecha animes, to please abandon said notions and to approach both shows with a more open and patient mind. So back to that first video. Back then, I really liked SSSS.Gridman, but wasn't certain on how I would rate it compared to some of my other favorites of that time. But as time went by after that video, the anime continued to linger in the back of my head for months, and I slowly but surely came to both realize and accept that Gridman was my favorite anime. For anyone that isn't aware, both of the animated works in the Gridman universe belong to a genre called tokusatsu, a word I had never heard before in my life until I started working on that first video. Despite not being familiar with the genre, I did recognize a lot of the titles related to it: Godzilla, Ultraman, Kamen Rider. The origins of Gridman itself can be traced back to a show that aired in the 90s called Denko Chojin Gridman, or Gridman the Hyper Agent. There's even the Western adaptation titled Superhuman Samurai Cyber Squad. Both of the installments in the universe are brimming with references to a lot of franchises, with the most notable one being character designs based off of the Transformers series, such as Shattered Glass Megatron, my beloved. I never noticed any of the references while watching, and even after reading about them, I don't really get them. I've heard Gridman be described as a love letter to the original tokusatsu shows of the pre-2000s. I can't substantiate this statement because I wasn't alive for most of the pre-2000s, but also because I've never seen anything related to the tokusatsu genre outside of the Gridman universe. So going into Gridman in 2020, I was wandering into a very foreign, unfamiliar territory with one simple notion that this was going to be a mecha anime. On more than one occasion in the past, when I've recommended SSSS.Gridman to someone, I've been met with the following reply: "Sorry, I don't like mecha anime." Even though I generally like the mecha aesthetic a lot, I should put it out there that I haven't seen any mecha animes before. I might have seen a random clip or two floating around the internet, but that would be about the extent of it. From this point of ignorance, it was easy for me to assume that the anime was going to be almost exclusively about giant robot fights and that there wasn't going to be much else of substance. Given that I've been able to watch the anime from start to finish twice since then, I know that this is far from the truth. In fact, I'll be arguing later on that these iconic fights take a backseat to everything else in the Gridman universe. I fully expected the first video to be around 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes max, but the anime blew my expectations so far out of the water that it instead ended up being an hour-long video. I'm almost certain that this enormous difference between expectation and experience is the reason why Gridman left such an unbelievable impression on me, to a point where I find myself thinking, how could something this good possibly exist, whenever the anime crosses into my thoughts. I fully understand that the previous statement will sound like complete exaggeration even to those that really like the anime, but I genuinely mean it when I say it. Much like the references present in the character designs, there is more than meets the eye in Gridman. And this is where the second half of my spoiler warning comes in, to approach the series with an open and patient mind. Both Gridman and Dynazenon love to take their time to tell their stories and aren't in any rush to complete them. This is, in my opinion, the single best decision made by Trigger in their production of the series. It's what enables the strongest aspect of the series, which we'll cover later in a chapter entirely dedicated to it. Watching Gridman again after a year has made me genuinely appreciate this aspect in a way that I never considered before, to a point where you could say that this series blew my already high expectations out of the water for a second time. This isn't going to be for everybody, but damn, it was perfect for me. Ladies and gentlemen, let us begin, for this is SSSS.Gridman, my favorite anime. I think that the handful of synopses of SSSS.Gridman that I've read around the internet are all unanimously pretty terrible, but I can't say that I blame the people that wrote these synopses for those being the way that they are. The first half of Gridman doesn't really give these synopses a whole lot to work with, so most of these synopses devolve into giving a rather generic description of episode 1, Yuta and his amnesia, how he meets Gridman, and then a monster appearing. Now, I'm not saying that a synopsis should contain everything about whatever it's summarizing from start to finish with spoilers filled to the brim. That's not the point of a synopsis. But there's a problem when the thing you read in the synopsis keeps happening for 4 or 5 episodes. It's a symptom of an overarching issue with the story, the lack of meaningful progression. The way that episode 1 is structured turns it into something that's really hard to summarize in a way that makes it sound interesting without picking apart every single detail within it. These synopses would have been fine if there was enough story progression happening within the first half, because then the synopsis only remains relevant for an episode or two. However, there isn't enough story progression for this to be true. Early on, Yuta still has amnesia with not even the slightest of hints as to what may have caused it, with a new monster of the week to transition into the fight scenes. The slice of life sequences that surround the consistent trends of those early episodes are all varied and interesting in their own rights, but these don't contribute to progression of the story in any meaningful way. As revealed in the back half of Gridman, story progression in the anime is very, very closely tied to character progression. However, this doesn't mean every moment of character progression leads to an equivalent amount of story progression. The first half of the anime is a very defining example of this. While there certainly are many excellent parts to the first half, it becomes formulaic. There's some slice of life thrown in there from time to time, some character development for Rika, Akane, Utsumi, and Yuta, albeit Yuta gets lesser than the other three, then the action sequence followed by a short bit of the characters reacting to the results of the action right before the end credits roll. Which episode am I talking about? Is it episode 4, 3, 5, or 2? Mind you, these still do contain great details and lines of dialogue for a number of characters, but these are moments that exist within the repetition and not something that is spared from it. Yuta and Gridman's amnesia certainly doesn't help, and the only thing Gridman really says is his incessant rambling about imminent danger. Each of the kaijus they defeat mostly don't matter because it doesn't get them anywhere closer to the source of these kaiju attacks or why the world seems to fully reset itself after each and every attack. These isolated plotlines from 2 through 5 are good and unique, but they don't largely contribute much towards unveiling some sort of direction that the anime is supposed to take. So if you aren't enamored with the quality of the action or the dialogue in the series, both of which we'll discuss eventually, it can be difficult to get invested in a story when the story itself doesn't show or tell you anything to get invested into. In hindsight, it's easier to notice details here and there that hint towards something greater in the future, but someone watching the anime for the first time isn't likely to either notice or remember those kinds of details. The only counterpoint I have to this is Akane, who is revealed in episode 2 as the primary antagonist of Gridman. I think the progression seen from her throughout that set of 4 episodes, while on the slow side, is great because it not only shows the 2 different sides of her, but also changes to both of those sides. Akane can be used as a segue to discuss how the lack of progression in the story succeeds in a single way for me, that being the slow build-up of tension. We know that Akane is a villain, and that she eventually begins poking around for details about Gridman, whereas none of the other protagonists have that knowledge. Therefore, any scene involving Akane brings a degree of tension to it. However, tension only remains tense if there's something that's pressing down upon it to eventually snap. The first half of Gridman doesn't have this. I say that 2 and 3 do a great job in creating that veritable sense of tension, but once you get around to 4 and 5, where things are still tense but there's nothing that actually amounts from it, the tension doesn't remain as strong as it once was. So yeah, the tension is pretty good at the start, but definitely tapers off as we keep going through those 5 episodes, albeit it doesn't ever become negligible or impossible to take seriously. The reason why I think it's so important to point out the weaker quality of episodes 2 through 5 is because I consider episode 6 to be a significant turning point in the anime's direction and focus. The anime essentially turns into an entirely different story that goes from a larger macro focus on the world, the kaijus and the action, to a concentrated micro focus on 2 characters. I think most people that have seen the anime all the way through would argue that the micro focus belongs to just one character, which is more than fair to say, but I think that the one character is too closely linked to the second one to be discussed without the other. Anyways, if the first half, due to some of its weaker qualities, failed to grab the attention of those watching it, then the viewer could be in a position where they simply drop it without ever getting to the latter half, which they may enjoy much more due to the progression that occurs through a series of episodes that are all distinct from one another. But even with that, there's also the chance that the reverse happens. Going from the first half to the second, action loses its priority to the dialogue and character progression, and for anyone that found the action to be the best part of the anime and didn't really care all that much about everything else happening around it, then the back half won't be as interesting as the start. While I thankfully didn't find myself caught on either side of the problematic fence, it's simply something that occurs by the virtue of having such different halves to a story. And what is frustrating to me is that I don't think there's a way to fix this problem. In my old video, I suggested that having the kaiju girl character make a few short appearances in a few episodes preceding episode 6 to hint towards her eventual reveal might get the job done. Nowadays, I don't think that would be enough. In fact, I think if that solution was implemented, it would exacerbate the issue of a lack of direction and progression more than anything, because now there's shots of this random character appearing and muttering nonsense while the story still isn't headed in any particular direction. The more I think of it, this just might be one of those problems where instead of trying to force a solution upon it, it's better to leave it alone rather than having said solution messing up other aspects of it. So after all that I said about the first half of the anime, I still think 2 and 3 are great, and 4 and 5 are decent, but end up being the weakest of the first 5. But please understand that this comes from the perspective of someone who was already invested after watching the first episode during my first time. I imagine that for anyone that wasn't sold after 2, maybe 3 episodes, the repetition and lack of direction may have posed a serious problem in terms of immersion or retaining attention. I expect this to be one of the most contentious points I'll be making within this chapter and arguably any of the chapters in this entire video, but here we go anyway. This would be the one thing between the past and now where my opinion of something tied to the series has degraded. The action went from something that initially got me hooked into the series to now what is something I merely tolerate. I think it looks cool and that's all fine and dandy, but at the end of the day, while I may have come for the action at the start, it's not the reason why I stayed. The main issue with action in Gridman is that while the style of presentation leads it to have novelty, unless you're a huge fan of it for reasons of passion and or nostalgia, it's not a style that has longevity. The way that Gridman and the kaijus move around is refreshingly awkward, and even though the older tokusatsu shows weren't a part of my childhood in any way, shape, or form, I'm sure that this acted as some hard-hitting nostalgia for others. However, after a while, you've seen everything. Most of the kaijus in the series are one-trick ponies, in that they only have one real move and nothing else going on for them aside from some wild thrashing and flailing. Gridman himself is a little better in those terms, because he has a more varied moveset and a more acrobatic but still clunky style of movement. The various transformations he acquires throughout the anime helps in this department as well. The fights themselves fall victim to being formulaic, much like a lot of the first half. For most of the fights, it follows the same general pattern of a kaiju appearing that wrecks some shit, and Gridman appears soon after. At the start, Gridman is outclassed by the kaiju, but once he gets some help from one of the Neon Genesis guys, Gridman overpowers and finishes off the kaiju. The fights I found to be the most interesting are the ones that broke out of this formula, those being the ones in episodes 9 and 10. In episode 9 and in the first fight of 10, the kaiju simply gets destroyed without much retaliation. In the second fight of 10, the kaiju is exponentially more powerful than any of the other kaijus that have been presented so far, and it almost kills Gridman by ripping him apart. But even though I find these to be the more interesting fights of the anime, I think it's because they were carried by the context behind and around those fights rather than the actual fight itself. It simply acted as another method of presenting the story or moving the story along. I would say that with the exception of the first fight of 12, every other fight in the anime outside of episodes 9 and 10 paused the story for the sake of the fight. Yes, there are occasional revelations that affect the story here and there, but these are rather infrequent and are very short when they happen and don't stand as fair comparisons to the heavier pieces of the story that are present in episodes 9 and 10. As stylized as Gridman's fight scenes are, these simply weren't enough to keep me enthralled after the umpteenth time. They're a visual spectacle for sure, but they weren't a spectacle that remained spectacular for me in the long run. The one main exception to this is the actual fight of episode 12 between Gridman and Alexis. This one is my favorite in Gridman and is a candidate for my favorite fight in the entire series, probably tied with the final fight of SSSS.Dynazenon. Yes, the criticisms I have for the action in it still holds true here and nothing has changed about that. However, it presented something a little more new in the fight by being the first and only fight in the entirety of the Gridman universe that doesn't involve a kaiju of any kind. It's also the fight that doesn't involve any of these shiny and clunky effects that's featured very heavily in the kaiju fights. While the effects in those fights are excellent and is one of the things that causes the action in the series to be one of its defining features, the lack of it here is a reason why this fight feels like it stands separate from the rest of the ones featured in the series in a really refreshing way. The music at the start of the fight helps in this department greatly as well. That being said, seeing Gridbeam go off again in episode 1 got me sitting there with a shit-eating grin on my face because it reminded me so strongly of the novelty that grabbed my attention back in 2020. And even though I gave it all this criticism, I think that this style of action is very important for one of the core aspects of the series that makes it so incredible. I hate to say this given the length of the video, but we'll get to that later with its own dedicated chapter. I wanted to begin the Gridman half of this video with what are my perceived weaknesses of the anime because of two reasons. The first, honest reason is that, well, I didn't have anywhere else to put it. But the second reason is that the remainder of this half is going to be almost entirely positive. Essentially, I've gotten all my gripes with the show out of the way. This was also part of the rewatching process that was more important for me to cohesively put together, since I don't think that the first video I made did a particularly good job on pointing out and elaborating on the specific problems of Gridman. I was so blinded with how much the anime had impressed me back then that these problems never truly became visible to me. And speaking of things that weren't visible to me on my first viewing, let's now transition into the second chapter. Let's talk about how episode 1 is an absolutely unmitigated mess. I think Gridman's first episode is fantastic in numerous ways, which sounds like a weird contrast to the way that I ended the previous chapter. Both statements are true. The first episode is a complete mess, but it's an amazing mess. When I first watched it over a year ago, I wasn't a huge fan of it then, but after having fallen in love with the series as a whole, my appreciation for this episode has greatly increased. One of the biggest strengths of the series is its atmosphere, and episode 1 does an impressive job in taking the first step towards the establishment of this strength. Cohesion is something I typically value in stories, looking at how well the individual and moving parts of the story all come together in terms of the overall narrative for either a specific episode, arc, or an entire anime. Two examples of cohesion that I really liked would be in episode 7 of Rent-A-Girlfriend and the Versus Mahito arc of Jujutsu Kaisen. However, the first episode of Gridman is in such a state of incoherency that the disjointed parts somehow all come together to illustrate a broken, unsettling atmosphere. The very first moments of the episode kick this trend off with Akane looking over the rooftop of her school as a set of flashing lights scatter through the sky, followed closely with the screen turning to black with a loud booming noise. Those who have seen the series will know that this is the moment in which Gridman and the Neon Genesis Squad enter the world, which I think is another great detail that gives additional value to rewatching the anime. Yuta's amnesia has no good explanation as to why it happened or where it's going to end up. Even when Yuta tries to ask around to find out what kind of person he was beforehand, Rika has never talked to him before the events of Gridman, so she knows nothing, while Utsumi only gives a painfully generic answer. I think the single best way in which the episode constructs its incoherency comes in the moment right after Yuta has his first encounter with Gridman on the beat-up old computer that he pops up on named Junk, where Rika comes into the shop to check in on how Yuta is doing. The conversation that follows is astonishingly disjointed, with the anime cutting from one shot to another anywhere from every other sentence to every other word. I still remember back when I first watched Gridman, I thought my screen was bugging out, so I went to load the episode on a different computer to see if it would be better, only to find out that the conversation was still as choppy and disorienting as before. The fact that it made me physically question the episode itself I think is a great indicator to how much that conversation between Yuta and Rika contributes to the incoherency of the episode, because it was so unexpected and something I had never seen before to such a point that I had to assume it was a technological mishap rather than an intentional decision on Gridman's behalf. As a side note, this broken conversation sequence stands as one of the most memorable scenes in the entire series for me, although not the most memorable one. As they're heading to the hospital, there's the giant kaijus that only Yuta can see. Again, back on my first run through Gridman, this wasn't something that I liked, stating the reasoning that the gimmick of only one person being able to see something was an artificial method of generating mystery and tension without putting in the investment to reap the same rewards. This also extended to Yuta's exclusive ability to see Gridman, leaving Rika confused, this one under the pretense that since Rika can see Gridman from episode 2 onwards, that this bit of mystery didn't even matter in the long run. While I can still understand where my past self came from, this is a perspective that I've dramatically shifted on, at least for Gridman. Going under that same umbrella of incoherency I've brought up a handful of times, this just adds more to it, especially since Rika's inability to see Gridman is what leads into the amazingly disorienting conversation sequence. And while the argument could be brought up that episode 1 is throwing in too many different things at once under that same umbrella, it's something I've grown more and more welcoming of, given how the anime ends up progressing. I think in order to create that sense of incoherency, it needs to be on this level of confusion. Gridman succeeds in making a sense of order out of this chaos as its episodes go by. In retrospect, I think it's all great. Samurai Caliber randomly appearing for a single shot across the street from Rika and Yuta is another contributing moment to all that incoherent goodness. And then we have what I consider to be the single best quality of the Gridman universe, the quieter slice-of-life sequences where the characters are simply being themselves without chasing the story's ultimate goal. Given the hectic and disorganized way that the episode starts itself with, I think the flash of normalcy that we get at the school is great. The atmosphere of that scene itself is wonderful, with the ambience being filled by a complete lack of music and only by the careless conversations of students nearby. When Yuta's sandwich gets crushed by Tonkawa's recklessness, it sits on that single awkward shot for almost 20 seconds with nothing but a slow zoom out and an announcement over the school speakers about something completely irrelevant. Rather than having any character overreact to the situation with silly faces or noises to try and make a punchline out of the moment, it decides to embrace the awkwardness of it all and make it the complete focus of the viewer for an uncomfortably long amount of time. Of course, not every single instance of these slice-of-life sequences are as awkward as this and are far more varied across both the remainder of Gridman and the whole of Dynazenon. It's the first in a line of some of my favorite moments not just in this series, but in all of anime as a whole. Outside of this, other moments that possess this quality without the same awkwardness within episode 1 would be whenever Rika is talking to her mom, when Yuta and Utsumi are walking to the shop, and the end credits where Rika is trying to process everything that happened during the day. The sudden transition at the end of the whole sandwich squashing shenanigan of revealing the kaiju carving is once again another example of an element that enhances the incoherency of the opening episode. One of the things I really emphasized in my initial video and in the first chapter for this video is dividing Gridman into two distinct halves. While that works conveniently in terms of story progression, another thing that facilitates this divide is that the start of each of these halves are incoherent. We already talked about how 1 does it, and 6 also does this in a similar way. A chunk of the episode is dedicated to what seems like a bunch of things that don't amount to anything. Yuta is wondering about how nobody remembers the kaiju that appeared in the mountain trip in 5 while wandering around the neighborhood. Rika gets bored and goes outside where she bumps into Auntie, giving him a meal and a bath. Utsumi is off at a memorial service where he eventually runs into Akane. While Akane trying to get information about Yuta off of him does have some impact in a conversation in the following episode, it ultimately isn't consequential in the long term. Auntie tries to kill Yuta near the end of the episode, and of all the non-expository things to happen here, this is the most meaningful one. It's a good moment to highlight the beginning of a change in Auntie's character that we'll get to later once we look at specific characters in greater detail. This leaves us with a lot of the midsection of this episode where a little kaiju girl comes into contact with Yuta. Her name is Anocilius II, and we'll be calling her as the second for the remainder of this video. In my old video, I praised this sequence for multiple reasons. The first is that the actual information provided to us by the second is unbelievable and hard to take in, given that it drastically changes the perspective of Akane from the viewer. The presentation of it is just as ridiculous on both audio and visual fronts. The second made for a great carrier of the exposition dump because she's a kaiju, which makes the information unreliable. But she also disappears at the end of the episode and doesn't reappear until the very end of episode 12, which means that there's no way to gain further explanation or clarification on the matter. Something that I also emphasized was that I myself was having a hard time believing it all. Maybe it's because this is my second round with Gridman, but I pretty much don't agree with anything that I said in the old video on this matter. I still think that the sequence itself is excellent, but for a different set of reasons. Firstly, this is finally what gets a new ball rolling in terms of story progression. Yuta is injected with all of this information that's completely foreign and new to him, which is information that he makes use of in the following episodes when trying to tell it to Utsumi and Rika, and also when Akane breaks into his room. This is by far the most important takeaway from this episode since it sets into motion the amazing second half of Gridman's story. The information that is given to Yuta during this sequence doesn't reveal anything particularly new to the viewer. We were already aware that Akane was the one responsible for the creation of the kaijus, and as to why she was creating these kaijus and resetting the world over and over. It certainly doesn't change our perspective of her because we're being told what we already know. The only new pieces of information that come out of this is that Akane is lonely, that she created the world, and that Alexis is using her in some way. Arguably, only 2 of these are truly new pieces of information since we've already seen Akane and Alexis interacting with one another several times, so it's not that far of a stretch to believe that Alexis has some nefarious motivation given his mostly mysterious nature. The 2 truly new pieces of information, while intriguing, are not groundbreaking or anything. Since she created the kaijus, creating the world is not the biggest leap of imagination. Her being lonely isn't something that is explored in great detail until a few more episodes down the line, so it still doesn't meaningfully change our perspective. To say that I had a hard time believing it back then was probably a result of me still being very excited about the anime and wanting to present it in the most exciting way possible, and while I still certainly love the series, I've since then calmed down and taken a step back to reassess that part of my statement. The utterly ridiculous presentation of the exposition dump succeeds in one major way. It forcefully grabs the viewer's attention. Everything leading up to the scene in the train has been mostly peaceful slice-of-life content. I think the dialogue during those parts is fantastic and serves as a great example of the biggest strength of the Gridman universe, but once the fog settles and the music kicks in, it causes such a dramatic shift in tone for the episode that even for those that don't particularly care for the quieter moments of the series, the jarring nature of the presentation brings everyone back into focus regardless of how invested they were into the moments leading up to it. At least that's what I imagine is the case. In fact, I really like that everything in episode 6 that leads up to the exposition dump is on the quiet and slow side of things, since it allows for the shift in presentation to have that extra punch to it. You could even technically argue that all of the episodes prior to episode 6 act in the same way, that they were made repetitive to allow for 6 to have more impact, but I think that's really pushing things. While I previously stated that Gridman avoids making this sequence boring thanks to a multitude of reasons, in hindsight I think that the jarring presentation is the main contributing factor in that department. I think the reason why the second act is such a good carrier for the sequence is because she stands out so far apart from every other character in the series. The closest connection to her would be Auntie, but even then the dots still don't perfectly connect outside of them both being kaijus. If the exposition was to be presented through another character, then I think it would have failed every single time. Because of the bizarre nature of the presentation and the location in which it all takes place in, a train ride that seems to be detached from the whole world and caught in its own limbo, it requires a character to match this tone, and any other character that we have would be too standard, for a lack of better words. As an aside, I always thought the second using music to wake Yuta up while outside the city perimeters was weird, but never really cared about it too much. Turns out it's some sort of reference to the older Gridman show, so that's completely fine by me. The reason why the incoherency of 1 and 6 is so fascinating is because these are things that get unraveled with each episode, and the story starts to become more and more clear, with each disjointed piece of the puzzle now locking itself into place as another stepping stone towards the full picture. Yet how each of these episodes handles this process is different as well. Episode 1's pieces are things that lock into place over the course of the entire anime. We have no clue as to what each individual aspect of the episode is supposed to mean in the grand scheme of things. On the contrary, episode 6 gives us the big picture in a rather straightforward manner, but doesn't give us all the smaller pieces that compose this big picture. The back half of the anime consists of exploring and expanding upon these smaller pieces, which is one of the many reasons why I think the latter half of Gridman is so good. My appreciation for the incoherent nature of these episodes certainly comes as a result of rewatching. The opening especially seems so much better than it did back when I first watched it because I know what's going to come next, so I can see how the anime's pieces are all set up before they come together. But this is just the kind of shift in perspective that occurs with rewatching something. I mentioned in the first chapter that one of the core problems with the first half of Gridman lies in the fact that there isn't much progression in the overall story, with no clear direction to indicate where things were even going to go. So by that measure, this level of incoherency present in these 2 episodes should be things that amplify that point of criticism. However, they stand apart from the rest of the first half of episodes with different reasons for each of them. Episode 1 scatters a lot of ideas and pieces that need to be put together, much like the individual parts of Gridman throughout the anime, and does so in such a disjointed manner that it's hard to process everything in one go. Episode 1 is the setup, and it's the lack of significant development on this setup in the following episodes that's the problem. Episode 6 is what begins to start organizing these pieces together slowly by introducing a greater narrative thread to follow, and is also the first main instance of the story finally being pointed down a specific path. So it's actually these moments of incoherency that lead to build-up and progression in the story. And I think that's going to be a good point to end this chapter on. The previous few minutes should have hopefully summarized how the story in Gridman is structured. For anyone that's confused on how the previous few minutes were supposed to summarize the structure of Gridman's story, that's okay, it's nothing to worry about. It'll become more abundantly clear once we enter the last 2 chapters of the Gridman half of the video. But before we get there, there's still a couple more boxes we need to check off. These first two chapters have had a very heavy emphasis on the story and atmosphere of Gridman, of how the incoherency of it all comes together in a surprisingly coherent way, and the problems of the story that exist within the layers of confusion presented by episodes 1 and 6. As a result, I've deliberately left out a lot of the details about the characters so that I can overload the remaining chapters with them, especially this next one. For those that have been very attentive so far, you might remember that I said that the latter half of Gridman becomes entirely about one character, or around two, as I will attempt to argue later. This next chapter is basically going to be about going through everything else about the characters that doesn't distinctly tie into the two specific characters and what they go through in the second half. Fasten your seatbelts, everyone, and hold tight to your special dogs, cause we've got a lot of characters to get through. To start this section off with an earth-shattering epiphany, Yuta is just okay. It's not like the anime butchers his writing or anything, but it's not shockingly great either. There's nothing about his character that is explored in any meaningful way, and the anime doesn't lose anything from this. But being a bland character isn't always the worst thing, and I think the anime benefits from Yuta never being a truly standout character. There's plenty of strong writing for other characters, and having an unremarkable character like Yuta means that the anime doesn't need to index as much time and resources into him, and instead work on making sure the characters that they do have interesting things to say for are as great as they can be. If the other characters in the anime weren't very good, then I'd point some heavier criticism towards having a bland central protagonist, but Yuta in his current state is totally acceptable for what the anime is trying to achieve. Yuta's amnesia is something that doesn't really amount to much in the long run. However, I do think that it does contribute strongly towards how broken the first episode feels. While yes, amnesia as a whole is something that fits right into the mold of incoherency, in this context, it's also very effective in throwing the viewer into a unique position by displaying the story through the lens of a character that isn't anchored to the world. There is nothing of value that can be said to describe Yuta's background in episode 1 aside from how Rika found him passed out near her house. And since there is nothing of value, episode 1 doesn't spend any time to say anything about it, and instead focuses on that loose jumble of incoherent threads. So basically, Yuta's amnesia is another mechanism which the anime uses in order to make even less sense of its own world in the first episode. Something similar can be said about episode 6 as well, with the interaction between Yuta and the second. In episode 4, the anime does a more than solid job in both painting out and developing a little bit on the fact that Yuta likes Rika in this episode. The sequence of Yuta, Utsumi, and the whole Neon Genesis gang trailing the group date is one of my favorite scenes in the entire series in terms of comedy because there are just so many of them, and even his momentary interaction at the end with Rika after the fight is a nice little cherry on top. That's why I think it's such a shame that the anime does nothing with this after the episode. Ultimately, it's not something that matters because the anime is written so well that it didn't need that specific plot point to fill any gaps or holes, but given that Yuta doesn't really become a particularly interesting character by the end, I think development on this front could have been helpful in that regard. In episode 11, we get the big old reveal that Gridman was Yuta the entire time, and that he had sort of hijacked Yuta for the sake of tracking down Alexis, which is how Yuta's amnesia came to be. In my old video, I harshly criticized this point as being, and I quote, not good since it came off as a very ham-fisted way of explaining away Yuta's amnesia, and that his amnesia didn't even need to be explained away for me by that point in the story. I've mostly gone from negative to neutral on this point. I still think I would have been okay if the amnesia was never explained given the focus of the story in the latter half of Gridman, but it's ultimately one of those things that didn't impact my experience of the anime in a majorly negative or a positive way. So yeah, very, very neutral on that now. Utsumi's character is in a weird position in that during the very early episodes, he's set up as a sort of contrast to Rika, which unfortunately for Utsumi, makes him very difficult to discuss without mentioning Rika a lot. As Rika's own storyline progresses and later intersects and overlaps with Akane's storyline, Utsumi is kinda left in the same spot that he was established in during those very early episodes, and doesn't really move out of it until the very end. Now, Utsumi is an alright character, he certainly has more going on for him than Yuta to say the least. It's just that there's a very noticeable gap in the middle of the anime where his character doesn't change or progress in any real way. If I had to give him one exception, it would have to be when Akane confronts him in the cafe in episode 6, but even then the results of the conversation are not particularly consequential. I suppose the best place to start with Utsumi would be with the ending to episode 1. I think the ending sequence of this episode is, surprise surprise, really good just like the rest. Once the kaiju goes down, Utsumi is super enthusiastic and wants to come up with a new name for their group in celebration, whereas Rika is completely exhausted and is worried about her friends Hase and Namiko more than anything else. I think this short sequence at the end does a solid job in establishing a starting point for each of these characters for all the episodes to come, and yeah, the school thing at the very end is also a pretty great twist. The contrast continues in episode 2, where it takes a decent bit of time to look into the traits brought up in certain characters from the previous episodes, such as Utsumi and Rika. And these characters couldn't be further apart from one another if they tried at this point. Utsumi is far too invested into the entire Gridman and Kaiju thing by basically calling the shots for the Gridman alliance by dragging them all along to the shop to talk to Gridman despite the shop being closed on the day. When at the shop itself, he's busy running circles around his own head about the supposed enemy and aliens. In the meanwhile, despite having been just as invested into the previous day's incident, Rika is characterized by spending a noticeable amount of time with her friends, with her original plan for episode 2 being that she was gonna go hang out with the two until she got reminded that Gridman exists, much to her dismay. The episode also highlights Rika prioritizing her friend's safety over anything else once that day's kaiju had been defeated. I won't go much deeper on the subject here because I need to save a lot of things to say for Rika later on, so instead let's throw down a question here. What is the point of having this contrast? This contrast is one of the many different ways in which Gridman highlights one of its own most important aspects, if not the most important aspect of the series as a whole, the dichotomy of everyday life and kaiju encounters. Utsumi stands as a representation of all the energy and hype that watching a big robot beating the shit out of a CGI dinosaur gives you, presenting a heavier emphasis on the immediate moments of the action. Rika stands as a representation for the more human aspect of the story that cares more about the consequences of the fights than the fights themselves, with a heavier focus on the happenings between the fights. In essence, Utsumi's perspective is the reason why I fell in love with the series, whereas Rika's perspective is the reason why I continue to love the series to this day. Returning back to Utsumi, as I said earlier, he doesn't get a whole lot of development past this point until the very end. After Yuta is injured and hospitalized in episode 11, the despair Utsumi feels at the hospital really puts a unique reflection onto his character. Aside from the remorse he feels for having enjoyed watching Gridman battle kaijus while lives were being lost as a result, his realization of a lack of purpose is a surprising twist. Everyone eventually leaves the hospital for one reason or another. Auntie leaves to go fight the newly reborn kaijus, Rika leaves in search of Akane, the Neon Genesis members and even Rika's mom leave in order to repair junk, and Yuta leaves in order to become Gridman once more. Utsumi is the only one that doesn't have anywhere to go or any purpose to fulfill at this moment in time, and when combining that with the aforementioned remorse he feels, puts a rather darker twist onto the traditionally inconsequential sidekick. This is me popping in while editing the video just to point out the fact that I hope you guys enjoyed hearing the word twist 3 times in the last 4 sentences because I'm just that good of a writer. And since I can't think of a better place to put this in, we'll do it here since it's kind of relevant to Utsumi. There are 2 pieces of criticism I laid against episode 1 in my first video that I would like to rescind here. The first is that I thought Rika and Utsumi were a little too quick to become willing to jump on board with helping Gridman, especially Rika given her earlier skepticism. It's not uncommon for people to come together during times of crises, and I think being able to see the kaiju tearing up the city is more than enough evidence to prove that Yuta was onto something when he was losing his mind earlier about Gridman and kaijus, so there's my counter to the first piece. The second piece of criticism from that first video is that the destruction of the school itself is something that holds very little value in episode 1 alone. Back then, I stated that the reason was that Tonkawa was merely a passing character, so killing her off here doesn't really have much impact. My perspective on this has similarly changed, since I know that this is something that becomes more significant later on as Akane's number of victims grows, this being something I didn't put much consideration into during that first video, so that's the counter to the second piece. There's a whole lot to talk about for Rika and especially Akane in the later chapters of this part of the video, but there's still some stuff worth covering here so that those later chapters can be a lot more focused onto specific episodes instead of needing to jump back and forth between early and later ones. We already talked in detail about the contrast between Rika and Utsumi in the early episodes, and since we talked about things from Utsumi's side, it's only fair to continue the discussion from Rika's side. In episode 2, as the Gridman Alliance is tracing the past of their now deceased schoolmates, rather than being determined to defeat some sort of ultimate enemy like Utsumi is, Rika's demeanor for the majority of the episode is quite gloomy over the prospects of potentially losing the people closest to her, with my favorite line in this regards to this being about how she doesn't want to be the only person that retains the memories of her friends. This is something that's made even better by the fact that it grows increasingly relevant as the episodes go by, and her polarizing contrast to Akane becomes more and more clear and significant. This is something that's immediately explored in the following episode. Even though I never thought of it this way when I watched the anime for the first time, Yuta's disappearance in episode 3 functions as Rika losing somebody close to her, Aside from being very upset in both the way she looks and how she responds to her mother, one scene that I really liked was when she and Utsumi head over to Yuta's place, but simply leave without ringing the doorbell even though Utsumi wanted to. They choose to leave because Rika doesn't want to have to face the reality in which Yuta did die in his battle against Anti. And furthermore, she says later on that she couldn't ask anyone about how he was doing because if Yuta truly did die, then his history would have been rewritten like Akane's other victims, so nobody would remember him anymore. In fact, Utsumi is just as upset as Rika is about the whole situation, going as far as to try and disband the alliance after he and Rika get into an argument. Interestingly enough, despite poking fun at the name of the alliance in the previous episode, Rika is the one defending it now, for the reason that the alliance gives Yuta a place to return to, given that he has nobody else in this world thanks to his amnesia. And even though this isn't explicitly stated by any means, I like to think that since Gridman is the one and only line of defense to protect the people Rika cares about from the kaijus, she greatly prioritizes being able to support that in any way possible. There's also the fact that Rika regrets not being able to apologize to Yuta for ignoring his call from earlier in the episode, and even though I don't think this is as impactful as her fears of episode 2 coming to reality in episode 3, it still adds to the grim nature of the episode. In episode 4, Rika wonders why kaijus appear around her so much and whether she's the cause of them. This really is an intriguing point to think about given that Yuta and the Neon Genesis guys all play a very active role in piloting and powering up Gridman during the fights. Utsumi might as well be in there with how worked up and excited he gets over them and even manages to provide some helpful insight very occasionally. On the other hand, the most we see out of Rika is in her interactions with Has and Namiko and plenty of other more grounded, mundane things. Therefore, her question at the end of the episode serves to ask exactly where she fits into all of this chaos, a question that becomes very important in the latter acts of Gridman. Akane first comes into the anime's focus in episode 2, since the key point of that episode is properly introducing her to the viewer. And damn, it's done so well. One of my favorite parts of her introduction is that there is no complicated build-up towards a grand reveal that she's the one creating the kaijus with the help of Alexis Karib. The anime barely goes from one shot after another showing the interior of her house and into her room, and into her eventual low-energy greeting towards Alexis. Within the house, Akane displays a more childish and excitable personality, as observed through the way in which she interacts with Alexis and her behavior as she observes her kaiju wrecking the city. This makes for a contrast between her more easygoing and amicable personality seen at school where she is supposedly very popular and sociable. The most fascinating part of this comes with how Akane seems to approach the appearance of both Gridman and the Alliance. Rather than viewing them as some sort of threat to herself and Alexis, she seems rather amused by their existence given the playful way in which she approaches Yuta when asking about the kaijus as well as some of her banter with Alexis when she brings it up to him. Another nice component from this episode that builds on Akane is the response she has to her teacher bumping into her in the hallway where she very visibly becomes upset, which sparks the creation of her next kaiju. This acts as a marker for her more reckless and volatile side, which could be categorized under the same wing as excitable, but I think is different enough. That brief moment of the camera zoomed in on her face makes for an attention-grabbing indicator that shit is about to go down. This volatile side to her is something that is repeatedly drawn attention to by the anime, as it causes the creation of numerous kaijus and a number of deaths. This eventually even comes back to haunt her later on, so I think it's great that the anime chooses to draw so much attention to it in this episode when it happens to outline it. The long, awkward pause in episode 1 works in the same manner as well, and is repeated in episode 4 when Akane enters the elevator while being very frustrated that she didn't get what she came for. During the rewatch, the long pause in episode 1 almost becomes agonizing, because now you have the knowledge that Tonkawa's actions here have locked in a certain death unbeknownst to the victim. There's always the question of when a story should reveal its villain to the reader or viewer. Revealing a villain too early can cause the events between the reveal and the final encounter to feel tedious and possibly even cause the progression towards the final encounter to feel predictable and inconsequential. Akane's reveal does a fantastic job at avoiding this problem by constantly switching over to her perspective and insight into other characters and the action. It also increases the tension in any scene that involves Akane, not only because we know that she's the villain, but because she's also shown a tendency to be very volatile. I think that if Akane's villain status was revealed much later on down the line, that it wouldn't be anywhere near as interesting. The anime has made it a point to highlight the conversations she's involved in with other characters, and she's strongly featured in the opening too, given that she isn't directly involved with the Gridman Alliance's grid-manning efforts, and because she'd be the only recurring character with no given identity aside from classmate, she would naturally have to be the villain simply by the process of elimination. I'm really glad that the anime didn't overthink things for this reveal, because really simple is sometimes the best way to go, which is really ironic for me to say given the length of this video. Another noteworthy thing for Akane throughout the first half of Gridman is Akane's growing obsession with Gridman. When Gridman and the Alliance first became relevant to her, she and Alexis were more amused by their presence over anything else. However, Gridman's repeated intervention has led to Akane's growing obsession with him becoming one of the central facets to the overall story. One of the things that comes out of this is that Akane starts to become increasingly active in trying to find evidence to confirm that Yuta is Gridman, which takes shape in episode 4 by her trying to question Rika as to why Rika has been talking to Yuta more as of late. During the group date, the anime does a great job in highlighting Akane's growing frustration as she's repeatedly interrupted by the very talented YouTubers. She goes on to eventually create a kaiju that not only targets these very talented YouTubers, but is also designed to be undetectable by Gridman. We can segue off of that to go into another result that comes from Akane's increasing obsession with Gridman, that being the evolution in her kaiju designs. The first kaiju was simply nothing more than that, it's a big old dinosaur. The second was designed to be immune to and reflect the grid beam attack which had defeated the previous. The third, Anti, was designed to not only be more effective in close quarters to handle caliber, but is also much faster as well. The fourth kaiju is designed in an attempt to completely take Gridman out of the equation by becoming undetectable. And the fifth kaiju is made to be so massive that the Hercules Combine Max Gridman, which by the way is my favorite combination, isn't big enough to overpower it, requiring Buster Gridman's rather convenient arsenal of projectiles instead. While this isn't something that makes the action more enthralling for me, it does act as a solid detail to help the case for Akane's growing obsession and a cool way to throw a little extra context into these fights. In episode 3, Utsumi is seen joking around in class about how since Caliber could transform into a big sword, what if the kaijus Gridman fought were also transformed humans? In response, Anti takes the spotlight as the kaiju of the episode. This question now comes back to haunt Yuta during the fight, and even though it isn't the only reason as to why Gridman lost, it still is an important one. It's also a question that remains relevant as Anti's story progresses. In terms of character arcs, Anti's is pretty darn good. Utsumi's joke of kaiju might be humans might be a little too appropriate when approaching this character, though. The most notable aspect of this comes with the fact that despite how Anti believes himself to be nothing but a kaiju, returning to his human form is inevitable given the strain the kaiju form puts on his body. Akane's treatment of him is another good part to both his and her character as well, with her at first treating him with much love and care due to his successes against Gridman, but after his first sign of failure, is completely and utterly abandoned. Anti only knows one thing, which is to eliminate Gridman, but he's never truly successful at being able to do so and is shunned by his creator for that fact. Yet despite the repeated failures and abandonment, because he only knows one thing, he has nothing else to do besides try and try again. This also extends out to when Anti begins taking measures to protect Akane, such as saving her from the forest fire, and even here, Akane doesn't really give him much thought and just leaves as if nothing happened. I think the first few episodes featuring him make for a good starting point by establishing this aspect of his story, with gradual changes happening as a result of him observing the changes in Akane. Last but absolutely not least, we have Alexis Karib. Whoever did the voice acting for Alexis Karib in the subbed version of Gridman did an absolutely phenomenal job. That compliment really extends out to the entire cast of the anime, but the way Alexis is done helps sell the unsettling aura that characterizes him. Unsettling really is the right word because there isn't anything about Alexis that is scary or intimidating or creepy or anything like that really. It's this mysteriously suave entity that hovers around Akane that simply acts as an enabler and allows her to do all the reckless and volatile things she wants to do with no stated motivation of any kind in the early episodes to support it. In episode 2, Utsumi is busy concocting conspiracy theories about aliens, and it turns out that there actually is an alien behind the entire thing. Alexis isn't developed upon until the latter half of the anime, but this is one of those things where I don't mind that there isn't any development in the first half. He sticks out in a very jarring way both visually and vocally, compared to every other character that the anime was simply better off letting him do his own thing and exert himself over the episodes, instead of forcing any development upon him. His unsettling, mysterious nature only adds to some of the more incoherent segments of the early episodes, most notably in episode 1, when he makes the briefest of appearances. And because I think I should mention them, the introduction of the Neon Genesis gang is solid. I don't have a whole lot to say on these characters for the sake of this video, but they're still an entertaining group to watch. Some of their individual interactions with Anti are good as well, but that leans more towards pushing Anti's character rather than giving any of the Neon Genesis guys some meaningful growth. So that's most of the characters I wanted to cover. There's still plenty of stuff I want to say for Akane and less, but still a lot for Rika as well. But before we do that, there's just one more chapter we need to power through. This next chapter is going to be the most important one throughout this whole video, because I'm going to attempt to define what makes SSSS.Gridman, and by extension the whole series, so unforgettable for me. If I had to pick a single aspect of the series to deem as my favorite, I'm going to surprise absolutely nobody and say that it would have to be the atmosphere. Both Gridman and Dynazenon do an astounding job in establishing their atmosphere and in multiple ways as well. The phrase that I said in the previous chapter when discussing Utsumi was the dichotomy of everyday life and kaiju encounters. That phrase right there is going to be the central focus of this chapter. While the anime's visuals are defined by the explosive kaiju fights that are the centerpiece of almost every single episode, I think that the atmosphere of everything that takes place between each of the fights is truly outstanding. While the contrast between the two sides of the series is quite obvious, and I already talked about it a bit in the previous chapter through Utsumi's section, something that is also definitely worth talking about is how one side helps to noticeably elevate the other. To be more specific, it's how the existence of the kaiju encounters help elevate the quieter moments of everyday life. There's a lot of adjectives that can be used to describe those kaiju encounters. Explosive, flashy, action-packed, intense, fast-paced, energetic, and many more. And for basically every single adjective you can think of, almost every scene in the series outside of those fights don't carry those same traits. A lot of the moments highlighting everyday life are far more quiet, with a greater emphasis on ambient noise and dialogue. It's almost as if you're watching an entirely separate anime when comparing and contrasting the two sides. The first description that came to mind when thinking about the disparity between the two sides in regards to the quieter side was that it was the eye of the storm, a moment of peace amidst the chaos. This isn't an entirely unfitting description or anything, but I think that an even better one that would specifically fit Gridman would be the calm between two storms. Each of the kaiju encounters are entirely separate events, rather than something that fits into a larger singular one. And yeah, that sounds stupidly obvious because each one takes place in a different episode and Akane has different goals every time she unleashes a new one, but hear me out on this one. Aside from these fights being separated in an episodic fashion, from a story standpoint, they are separated through the world resetting after each one thanks to the efforts of the giant kaiju monuments that cover the city in a fog after each fight. The phrase "eye of the storm" implies that the chaos caused before and after the brief moment of peace is the same single storm. Now, as a matter of fact, Gridman does have this in exactly one of its episodes, episode 10. But when looking at every kaiju encounter preceding this episode, they are all severely ripped apart from one another, each one technically taking place in its own individual timeline. So that's why I view each of these kaiju encounters to be so separated from one another, as their own individual storms. So the world is constantly changing, with stretches of peace and quiet being torn apart by vicious kaiju attacks only for the world to move on to the next day, as if nothing ever happened, because in the minds of most people, nothing did happen. And this is exactly the reason why I think the phrase "calm between two storms" is so perfect to describe those moments of peace and quiet in Gridman. The enabler for that calm between two storms, and what is responsible for the kaiju fights being so separated from one another, is how the world of Gridman resets itself. I've always loved this mechanic of the world resetting the damages after each and every fight. Every death results in a change in the histories and memories of everyone, with the exception of the very few that retain them. This provides a clever explanation as to why the city is completely fine after getting rolled through by a kaiju every so often, and as to why the people of the city don't make a big deal about it, and it's done in a very unique way through the repairing kaijus as well. Furthermore, it helps put the main characters of the anime in a unique position that also has some impact on parts of the story, such as when they try and ask their classmates about the kaiju attack, or when they visit the families of the victims to see if they know anything else, only to discover that the history of the victims has been rewritten so that they died several years before the events of the anime, at least in the case of Tonkawa. In Gridman, the world resetting at the end of most kaiju encounters causes everyone outside of the main cast of characters to return to their everyday lives, as if nothing ever happened, because to everybody else, nothing happened. An interesting consequence of this is that this forceful return to normalcy allows some of the main characters to return to normalcy as well, at least partially. Yuta and Akane are really the only characters that never truly experienced that normalcy because of their positions as outliers within the city, but Utsumi and especially Rika are seen periodically returning to their regular lives between each dramatic encounter. The anime does a wonderful job in depicting these moments in a multitude of ways. There's this intangible quality to these scenes that I love that I'm going to try my best in illustrating, but I don't think there's going to be a perfect way I can really encapsulate that feeling. If the following section doesn't make any sense to you, then I apologize in advance, and I also completely understand. The biggest one to point out is that during these moments, there's a very heavy emphasis on the dialogue and ambient noises. The ways in which the conversations are both written and delivered by the voice actors gives an effortless, unforced, and natural quality to them, and this works wonders with the incredibly sparing use of music in the series. I don't know why it took me until watching Dynazenon to notice this, but the Gridman universe is very picky when it comes to where it wants to use music in the background over ambient noises. Outside of fights and a few specific moments, both anime don't use any music whatsoever. Instead, the background is filled with the idle chatter of nameless classmates, the buzzing of insects, the sound of falling rain, the various mechanical noises of vehicles, and the best one of them all, the silence of nothing happening. Now, I recognize that this doesn't sound like a very impressive thing when you list them off, because after all, they are just ambient sounds. And by itself, sure, the ambient sounds aren't all that much. I think that the sound design as a whole in the series is excellent, but that by itself is just a small component of a larger product. What is so captivating about the combination of dialogue and ambient noise in the series is not what it brings as a result of its combination, but rather in what it doesn't bring. There is no random music playing in the background or characters exacerbating their personalities and gimmicks in these conversations, and the voice acting doesn't force the conversation to become interesting in any way by inputting any dramatic and emotional weight into their lines to a point where it exceeds realism and enters a fictional territory that is so common to see in anime. It can be entertaining, but it will often come at the cost of a sense of realism in interactions. The topic of a lot of these conversations also varies wildly. Sometimes it's about the kaiju attacks from the previous day, and at other times it's about procrastinating on schoolwork. Sometimes they're making plans for after school, and sometimes they're trying to track down the history of Akane's victims. The anime is willing to give characters the time they need to simply be individual characters instead of being persistently enslaved to progressing the story by putting an equal amount of emphasis on a lot of the dialogue regardless of how mundane the topic at hand is. Every piece of dialogue is treated equally, every single spoken word is important. Something else that's also worth calling out is that the series is never afraid to sit on a moment and let it linger to highlight the awkwardness of the situation, such as the instance of it in episode 1 that I've already brought up a few times. And even though these awkwardly long pauses are used sparingly, I love it when it happens. It's always used to highlight one hyper-specific thing about a situation and essentially drown out everything else that's happening at that moment until that one hyper-specific thing is resolved. Tonkawa accidentally crushing Yuta's lunch and the entire classroom goes quiet as what just happened sinks in. Vit needs to go help Gridman and everyone in the room, but Vit realizes this, so everyone stares at him until things finally click for him. When the question is posed as to who in the Neon Genesis gang is the strongest, none of them reply because nobody wants to admit that anyone else is stronger than them. For an example out of Dynazenon, there's the scene where Yomogi is sitting across the table from Yume and both of them are almost completely silent because Yomogi doesn't know how to make small talk. This also causes whatever the next following shot will be to become more interesting just by the virtue of it being a break away from the long pause, even if the next shot ends up being as mundane as the pause it broke free from. It's such a simple thing that adds so much to the scenes it occurs in and adds a lot to the characters being awkwardly focused on. It's a perfect example of a deafening silence. The environmental design is also another contributor to those peaceful and quiet moments in the same way that the ambient sounds contribute to them. The wavering and blinding heat on the hottest days, the dull and colorless sky during the rain, the fog that drowns out the city whenever a kaiju approaches, and the ever-present figures of the unmoving kaijus towering over the city from an unimaginable distance. Those passing shots of the kaijus in the distance are some of the most visually memorable frames of Gridman for me, and they always act as a reminder of the fact that within this city, you're always minutes or seconds away from the next big kaiju rampage, and the main characters are the only people in the city that know this, and they can't do anything to stop these attacks from happening since counterattacks are their only viable weapon. I guess the best way to truly summarize all of this will be that the series exceeds in its ability to depict realistic conversations in realistic settings, all while making it very clear to both the characters and the viewers that there is danger inevitably looming over these moments of peace and quiet. Each of those peaceful and quiet moments become precious, especially in the latter half when the entire story begins to collapse into itself as the dialogue and interaction takes precedence over everything else. And the kaiju encounters contrast these moments in not just energy alone, but greatly in the presentation as well. In most scenes, the movement of characters aren't over-animated or very lively in any way with the exception of a few characters, but almost every single one of those characters are specifically designed in a way to noticeably stick out compared to everyone around them. The backdrops are never extraordinary and always believable, and the anime never resorts to any dramatic angles or perspectives to make scenes seem more exciting unless, similar to the few characters with exceptions in their movements, the shot is specifically designed to forcefully draw the viewer's attention. When it comes to the fight scenes, the anime throws its typical tendencies out the window in exchange for camera shots that are constantly changing to follow the movements of these giant creatures, with the frames shaking to highlight the screeching roars of the kaijus or Gridman's thunderous footsteps. Obviously, the movement is incredibly different with the weird waddling of the kaijus to the acrobatic feats of Gridman. The faster and more energetic music is another easily noted difference as well. So given how much of a far cry these fight scenes are, in contrast to the quieter moments, the action of the series genuinely helps complement those moments and highlights the piece in a truly special way. But that's not all, because despite everything I said, the action still influences the peaceful moments in some unique ways. It's not necessarily with what happens during the action, but rather the consequences of them. The loss of certain characters influences others, most notably Rika, and this is reflected in their dialogue and behavior afterwards, but in ways that don't dominate or redefine their character entirely. The characters are still able to be themselves while responding to the changes around them in both the short and long term. Once again, that doesn't sound all that special, and Gridman certainly isn't some sort of genius for doing so, but when framed within the context of the contrast set by the two halves of the anime, it fits in perfectly and is another way in which the contrast is highlighted. I think some people will perceive these conversations as being really boring, and I can't blame them for thinking so. To be completely honest, these conversations are mostly uneventful and carry that feeling of nothing happening. But for me, that's the best part of it. Something doesn't need to happen at every part of the story, and the people who work on the series seem to understand that perfectly. Yes, I understand that the first 5 episodes of the anime are mostly at a standstill in terms of story progression, but I'd say that's more or less the fault of the anime's inability or perhaps even refusal to provide the necessary details to get the story going. It doesn't diminish the quality of the dialogue and piece in any way. Gridman contains the most realistic, immersive interactions and dialogue between characters I've ever seen, and it's always the first thing that pops up into my head whenever I'm reminded of this anime. It's ironic to realize that a lot of effort must have gone into making these scenes feel so effortless, to make it feel like I'm listening to an actual conversation and not just a performance by a voice actor. I can't think of any other word to describe this besides brilliant, and this quality shines at its absolute brightest in the final 6 episodes of Gridman. While SSSS.Gridman can be very cleanly divided into 2 halves, the latter half by itself can also be divided into 2 halves, albeit in a less distinct manner compared to looking at all 12 of the episodes. Excluding episode 6, you can take episodes 7 through 12 and split them into 2 groups, the first consisting of 7, 8, and 9, and the second consisting of, as you might expect, 10, 11, 12. The first group would be the exposition and build-up leading into the final episodes, or for anyone that wants a more catchy and dramatic title, The Beginning of the End. It's a series of events that act as a catalyst into the unraveling of Akane's mental state and her world as a whole. The second group would be exactly that, the end. As the world is rapidly falling apart, character arcs come to a close and conflicts are resolved as the anime begins to narrow its scope down to its very simple ending. Rather than the anime's tension rising as each of these 6 episodes progress, I view the tension as peaking in episodes 9 and 10. 7 and 8 build towards this peak, while 11 and 12 narrows the story back down. This is most evident when looking at the complexity of the story told in each of these episodes, with 9 and 10 being significantly more complicated than the remainder of the set, 8 and 11 having strong segments of complexity that don't reach the highs of 9 and 10, while 7 and 12 are mostly simple and straightforward episodes, and those 2 groupings of episodes will be the final 2 chapters of this half of the video. This chapter will cover 7 through 9, while chapter 6 will cover 10 through 12. These 2 chapters will consist mostly of analysis and very little critique, as I pretty much have nothing but praise for them. The best part of episode 7 comes in the form of Akane's attitude in a multitude of ways. Akane breaks into Yuta's apartment in the hopes of collaborating with Gridman rather than combating him, which makes for the first time in the anime where Akane isn't doing something to try and either locate or fight Gridman. Given that the last kaiju she created was of such enormous scale and destructive capability in the form of the mountain kaiju, this marks a stark contrast to that note. Despite the cheeky tone with which she approaches Yuta, that moment of silence right after she asks Yuta whether or not she's his friend ended up being a really standout moment for me because of how much was conveyed despite how little was said, and also with the immediate change of subject afterwards. Friendship is a very essential theme throughout Gridman, to a point where it kind of hits you on the nose with it every once in a while. Yuta was going off about how he doesn't want to betray his friends before Akane hits him with the aforementioned all-important question. His inability to answer her question speaks volumes about how he views her, which I imagine can't feel all that good to hear, or not hear, for Akane. Then there's the morbidity of going to the restaurant of Tonkawa's family, where Akane reveals some of the petty reasons behind some of the kaijus she created, like Tonkawa accidentally ruining Yuta's lunch, so Akane accidentally ruined Tonkawa's entire existence. I said this back in my first video too, but I think this is the moment in which you can pinpoint the beginning of Akane's downward spiral. So far, she has been unable to defeat Gridman, and since her attempt to collaborate with him didn't work either, she has to go back to her original plan. Whether or not she actually wants to do that is an entirely separate question that's worth considering but isn't really answered in the anime, at least within this episode. But given the lack of success she's seen on that front despite the numerous changes she's implemented, she has now taken upon the task of proving that she's capable of protecting her own world from Gridman, which begins by surrounding herself with the relics of her past successes, in addition to being accompanied by Alexis, the source of all her power. When Alexis brings up to Akane that Auntie despises Gridman more than she does, she seems initially surprised, then very displeased. It's been made clear to the viewer by this point that Akane cares very little for Auntie given the way she treats him outside of any opportunity where she can take advantage of his loyalty to attack Gridman. So Alexis bringing this up now is the first time in which she's had to take a second to consider Auntie's perspective. Given that Auntie was created for the sole purpose of defeating Gridman and his repeated failures that it has caused his creator to both abuse and abandon him, it would naturally make sense that his hate for Gridman borders on a similar level to, if not exceeding that of Akane's due to how both Gridman has influenced their lives in a rather negative way. Near the end of the episode, Alexis says something along the lines of how the ability to create true kaijus is something that only a true human like Akane can do, to which she responds by saying that it's only something she can do. While this isn't particularly significant, the way she responds to Alexis here is notably intentional in the way that it's written, given that she says the same thing that Yuta said when he got his primal acceptor, the little Gridman watch he has, of something only I can do. I find this brief moment to be another critical moment in the timeline of Akane's downward spiral. Despite Akane recognizing that the creation of true kaijus is something only she can do, this has been met with repeated failures, as mentioned before, outside of the first few casualties. In reality, this ends up becoming the only thing she can do, as she herself is powerless against Gridman without the use of her kaijus, and this is something that becomes a greater and greater burden on Akane over the next few episodes, most visibly in episode 9. There's also a line in here that goes, "The stronger the hate, the stronger the kaiju." This is one of the single most important lines in the entire anime, so please remember this one. It'll become incredibly relevant in the following chapter. A subplot in episode 7 comes in the form of Yuta's efforts to try and convince Rika and Utsumi about the truth of this world and Akane's real identity. Even though nobody believes Yuta at first, it's perfectly understandable because there is no reason to believe him given the outlandish nature of the information he's trying to deliver. I think the anime does a solid job at delivering that scene with how dismissive Rika and Utsumi are, Yuta looking like he's trying to convince himself as he's talking to them, and especially when Utsumi has that 1 second of hesitation when Rika makes fun of Yuta for proposing the idea that Akane might like kaijus given Utsumi's interaction with Akane in the previous episode. Given the outrageous nature of Yuta's news, it should go without saying that the proof necessary for convincing Rika and Utsumi should be just as outrageous, which is where the city in the sky comes in. It's a shame that the concept of the city perimeter isn't something that is explored in a more extensive way, but I think it's ultimately okay. The shot of the city in the sky gets the job done, and begins to sell everyone on the batter, which is all it needed to do. The few other bits of it we see in episode 6 are also good for establishing the atmosphere for that episode. So yeah, episode 7 is mostly straightforward, or at least as straightforward as any of these back half episodes get. Episode 8 marks the start in a series of very densely packed episodes. In the early portion of the episode, Akane's approach is far more straightforward compared to every other appearance of hers we've seen. In my previous video, I stated that the reason behind this was because Akane was confident in her ability to defeat Gridman. After my second time through, I'm more leaning towards the reasoning that Akane is as assertive as she is because she wants to ensure that this encounter with Gridman happens in order to show off the capabilities of her new kaiju. This would also explain why Akane is so dismissive of Utsumi and Yuta when they try to convince her not to unleash the kaiju upon the school because Akane had already made up her mind that this fight needs to happen. She does give the reason that she hates the festival, but it's clear that this is a very weak facade she's thrown together to cover up her true reason. Sure, maybe she doesn't like other people being in a celebratory mood when she isn't, or possibly even some sort of festival-related trauma in her past we as the viewer aren't privy to, but at face value it's still a weak reason. Akane becomes as upset as she does at full power Gridman because it's something she never took into consideration or even knew was possible, which messes with her attempt at a carefully crafted attack again. A short while later, Akane and Rika's conversation on the bus ends up raising a very fascinating point about Rika's character. While Rika has, on multiple occasions, brought up that Akane is her friend or at the very least somebody she cares about, yet despite all the times she says this, there's barely any real interactions between Rika and Akane that would denote that level of friendship between the two. Rika even mentions in episode 4 that the two of them haven't really interacted in a while. So once Akane mentions the fact that she created this world so that everyone within it would love everything about her, suddenly it makes sense as to why Rika views Akane in such a way. It would also explain why Rika is never seen condemning or reprimanding Akane for any of her actions, and is sometimes even seen defending Akane. This bus scene, in a visual sense, is also carbon copied over into episode 9, and the difference between the scenes in 8 and 9 will become more important once we get into episode 9. On the night before the attack, Akane is very quiet and seemingly lost in thought as she stares into one of her many cases full of kaijus. Despite all of the words of encouragement coming from Alexis, Akane doesn't respond to him with the usual energy she possesses when doing so. It's obvious that this upcoming attack is an important one to her, and the weight of that attack seems to be very clearly pressing down upon Akane. All things considered, this kaiju is the one she poured the most effort into and holds a lot of significance in both its purpose and design. I think that this brief scene does a good job in outlining the importance of this event in relation to Akane. While for the Alliance, this is merely just another attack they need to defend against, for Akane this literally means the world tour. Once the actual attack commences, it's a complete and utter failure for Akane in every imaginable way. Gridman, in a janky yet careful manner, evacuates everyone at the school, and the kaiju doesn't even tickle full-powered Gridman. It has its neck broken almost immediately, then fucking explodes. Since I brought up the kaiju, let's also look at the significance of its design. The visual design of kaijus is going to become very important to analyze in another specific episode of Gridman. This kaiju's design is important because it's a retrofitted version of the first ever kaiju Gridman fought after arriving in Akane's world way back in episode 1. It's indicative of her desire to replicate her early successes, where she was able to both take out her target and reset the world successfully despite Gridman's intervention. This continues to support the idea that Akane is attempting to prove to herself that she is capable of defeating Gridman because she was able to do so in the past. So not only is this newly fitted kaiju defeated in spectacular golden fashion, Akane also fails in creating any casualties or significant damage, maybe outside of some structural damage from all the stomping around that happens. Akane put the most effort into preparing for this fight, yet the only thing that has come of that effort is what is now her greatest failure, and this is reflected perfectly in the aftermath of the kaiju attack shown in the post-credits scene. The aftermath of the kaiju attack on the school is not only the first time in which Akane's downward spiral is being visually represented, but also the first time in which Alexis expresses negative sentiment towards Akane. Previously, while there were signs pointing to it, the anime never was too explicit with depicting Akane's downward descent. Now she is collapsed on the floor, lacking any of the excitement or anger that followed her previous defeats, and is blankly staring into a mirror while Alexis looms over her, stating his disappointment. Furthermore, leading up to this very moment, Alexis has done nothing but praise Akane's creativity and capability, being the ultimate enabler for her behaviors. If some of the earlier signs pointing towards Akane's downward spiral wasn't enough, then this very brief but very important aftermath should signal that the story is about to take a significant turn. It's also interesting to mention just how much of a good time everyone else seems to be having at the school festival during the end credits. While I think it's another example of that brief return to normalcy between attacks that I've talked about before, where characters are being themselves, albeit in a more unique setting this time, the positivity that radiates from the end credits comes as a stark contrast to the dark and depressing scene that's about to follow it. It's a big contributor to why the post-credits scene of episode 8 was as effective as it was for me. Looking outside of Akane, episode 8 contains something else that I also think is very good. The argument in the shop between Utsumi and Rika is a wonderful scene for two reasons. Firstly, it's another example of the style of dialogue that defines the quieter moments of the Gridman universe, one that eventually escalates out of that quieter tendency as it turns into a full-blown argument. Secondly, it's the first major case of an internal conflict within the Alliance itself. Utsumi is heavily focused on creating a plan of attack, while Rika wants to take a more pacifistic approach. Aside from those two different perspectives, Rika eventually points out that Utsumi only wants to fight because that's what he's invested in, and doesn't consider other perspectives as a result. This facet of Utsumi's character is something that eventually comes back to haunt him in one of the last few episodes. Another thing she mentions about Utsumi is that he really is the only one who calls the group the Gridman Alliance on a regular basis and in a serious way, which ends up being a rather notable point given that whenever Utsumi says something on the behalf of the Alliance, it really just ends up being him voicing what he wants to do. This only happens to be the first time Rika, or anybody really, ever spoke out against him because it directly concerns a person she happens to care about. The scene presents not only the Gridman Alliance under a new light, but also some new ways to view Utsumi, who has been a rather static character for a while by this point. And here we are, episode 9, my single favorite episode in any anime to have ever existed. Episode 9, compared to any other episode in both Gridman and Dynazenon, stands out in a very unique way compared to every other episode in the series. The closest thing to it that I can think of would be episode 10 of Dynazenon, yet this significantly different episode stands as the keystone in all of Gridman. Since the anime begins the episode by drawing attention to the kaiju, let's also start by doing the very same thing. The first main difference is that the kaiju featured in episode 9 is very different from every other kaiju in Gridman in three major ways. The episode opens with the introduction of a kaiju coming into existence right away, whereas every other episode took at least the first half of the episode exploring something else before revealing the kaiju in the back half. The closest thing we have to this is episode 3 with the introduction of Anti, but even there, the episode opens with the human form of Anti and his kaiju form takes a couple minutes before appearing. The second main difference between 9's depiction of its kaiju compared to every other one is that this one stands perfectly still, and even when it does move, it simply phases through the world without causing any amount of destruction. Every other kaiju has always taken on the form of a rampaging monster that always causes enormous levels of destruction. And this leads into the third main difference of the kaiju, that being its purpose. The other kaijus were meant to kill and destroy for the sake of reconfiguring parts of the world Akane wasn't happy with, whereas this kaiju is completely pacifistic. Even when Powered Xenon, the combined form of the 4 Neon Genesis members, attacks it near the end of the episode, there is pretty much no retaliation and it just gets destroyed. Its entire purpose is to act as the host of 3 separate dreams, one each for Yuta, Utsumi, and Rika. Outside of the 3 different reasons, the shots of the unmoving kaiju looming over the city underneath a rainy night sky gives it an ethereal and pristine quality that other kaijus, even those featured in Dynazenon, simply don't have because of their typically more monstrous tendencies. The 3 dreams created by the kaiju all share the same goal of finally accomplishing what Akane's first dream world stopped doing, worlds in which everyone loves her. There are 2 main things to note across all 3 dream worlds. The first is that each dream is specifically catered to either Yuta, Utsumi, or Rika, and that only one of these 3 exist in each of the dreams. The second is that kaijus, or rather the physical manifestation of kaijus, are non-existent in these dreams. From Akane's side of the story, Gridman is the villain that threatens her creation, who she believes has been attracted to it due to the presence of kaijus. Evidence to support this would be that kaijus simply don't manifest in the new dreams. It's to prevent them from acting as beacons to attract Gridman. Furthermore, as seen by the shot in Yuta's dream, there are no colossal kaiju statues far off into the distance. These are the kaijus that were used for repairing the city and altering the timeline after each attack, but that single shot of them being absent from the skyline is the biggest hint towards how Akane views these dreams. Without these kaijus, there will be no method of repairing the city or altering the timeline, but since kaijus won't manifest within these dreams in the first place, there will be no destruction to repair or timelines in need of altering. The dreams are designed as recreations of a perfect world that is no more, with a final desperate attempt to ward away the mechanical demon that destroyed it. But even though Akane doesn't need or want kaijus in these dreams, Alexis is still shown to be there. If kaijus don't need to be made anymore, then Alexis doesn't need to be there anymore since its contributions would no longer be necessary. Yet his presence still towers over her, and given the very close-up shot of his face the anime goes out of its way to show to the viewer, it's indicative of his growing pressure and control over Akane. Or maybe Akane likes hanging out with Alexis and I'm reading too much into a 1-second shot of his face. The easiest dream to look at is Yuta's. The way it opens obviously mirrors the way that episode 1 does, and the general course of events of the first day are almost identical with the exception of the unbelievably hyper-subtle detail that Akane replaces Rika in every way possible. Seriously, I don't know how they got away with it. Yuta wakes up and can't remember anything, looks at himself in the mirror, wanders out into the shop, comments about how thick the mist is, goes to the hospital, goes to the convenience store, then returns to home. Yet there are differences present here not within what happens, but in what is said. In episode 1, Rika's initial reaction to Yuta's amnesia is a combination of disbelief and exasperation that Yuta might be pulling some sort of weird prank on her. In episode 9, Akane is the one who straight up tells Yuta that he has amnesia. Later on, while at the convenience store in episode 1, Rika sets the record straight by telling Yuta that before this event, they barely ever talked. In episode 9, however, Akane tells Yuta that the 2 of them are dating. While in the grand scheme of things, the actual lines themselves aren't too important, the intent behind these lines is more significant. In episode 1, the way Rika tells the truth about the situation still leaves things incredibly vague and as foggy as the mist itself, despite Rika being completely honest about the situation. Yuta is essentially a free-floating individual that is not connected to anybody in any way due to his amnesia. The closest person he would have would be Utsumi, and Utsumi still recognizes that there's a rebuilding process that needs to happen between the 2 of them. In episode 9, Akane's direct claim about both Yuta's amnesia and his relation to her sets him on a course to follow, one that was completely fabricated by Akane. Although if we want to get technical, everything else in the anime was fabricated by her too, but you know what I mean. Anyways, she now gives him a person to anchor to directly, and now his life within the dream goes as Akane dictates. Because what else would this amnesiac be able to do? Even the gift of the watch that Akane gives to Yuta to wear on his left wrist takes the place where Gridman's device usually is. Yuta is meant to be hers, not Gridman's. The way Rika's dream opens is done with essentially the same intent as that of Yuta's, albeit through the presentation of a completely original scene. Rika runs into Akane in the infirmary of the school where they have a little chat. The part that I found the most interesting out of that specific scene involved 2 things Rika says. When she asks where Akane went for middle school, and when she comments on how huge of a coincidence it is that their houses are very close to one another. Akane's response to the first statement is that it's a secret, and her response to the second statement is a short pause followed by agreement. Even though it's a bit of a stretch, I like to think that Akane's first response is the way that it is, because she never designed the past for herself in this dream, so she doesn't have an actual answer to give. Therefore, she says her middle school is a secret, both to cover up the fact, but also to live up to the more playful and amicable side of Akane that we saw at school before her world started falling apart. The pause before Akane's second response silently speaks volumes, in the sense that Akane recognizes that none of this is a coincidence and that everything is laid out according to her plan. Yet these dreams begin to unravel and come apart once those who reside in it encounter relics and remainders of the real world. For Yuta, it's the tombstone of Tonkawa. For Rika, it's the bus where Akane told her that she was created for the sole purpose of being her friend. In the case of Yuta, he says that he feels that he's forgotten something important, something that is important to both himself and Akane. He realizes this something shortly after, that being the fact that both he and Akane must awaken from the dreams that they've been put into. In Yuta's sense, it's the actual dream he's currently within, but for Akane, it's from the world she created with the help of Alexis. In Rika's case, she merely apologizes to Akane and gets off the bus. Even when Akane reminds her that she was created to be her friend, there is no significant response out of Rika aside from the apology. Yet, much like the scene in the infirmary, I think the value of that scene comes from what isn't said rather than what is. Rika recognizes and accepts the fact that she was created to be Akane's friend by this point, but she realizes that Akane doesn't belong in her own world no matter how much she wishes to. When comparing this scene to its almost identical twin in episode 8, the key thing to highlight here is that Rika actually has a response this time rather than being taken aback by the things Akane says. Rika seemingly has pondered and come to terms with her existence, whereas Akane is still in denial. Rika's response isn't all that dramatic or anything, but she says just enough for Akane to get the message. Despite Akane's best efforts, her creations have turned against her for her own good, and she has finally accepted that the end is about to come. So that's 2 out of the 3 dreams, since I basically skipped the entirety of Utsumi's dream. This is because I don't think his dream is anywhere near as significant or as deep as Yuta's or Rika's, given that it mostly consists of Akane more or less buying his friendship. Although I think the point could be made that the contents of Utsumi's dreams are more shallow because Akane probably isn't as close to or familiar with Utsumi besides his love for kaijus, so she leaned into the one thing she knew about him as hard as she could. One of the best things about this entire episode is atmosphere. The dreams themselves are meant to be the perfect recreations of Akane's ideal world, yet there is a sense of depressing irony to it all. It's made fairly clear that Akane herself exists separately from the dreams, given that she's shown to be atop a crane with Alexis, observing the kaiju from a distance, commenting on the events as they happen. Even when the dreams are in their perfect early states, Akane still remains very gloomy, and as the dreams begin to unravel and come apart, her tone and voice becomes more desperate and helpless as the anime repeatedly and abruptly cuts back to Akane crying out in reaction to the events. Even within the perfect early phases of the dreams, they are still broken and cracked, haunted by the rot of Gridman as shadows of him flicker in the reflections of signs and buildings. Shades of samurai caliber blink in and out of vision, and we observe Utsumi and Akane from the same perspective that Bohr did several episodes ago. Outside of the dream, the only noise that exists is the falling rain and train signals, both of which only last for the duration of the dream, almost as if the entire city has fallen asleep to this ambient lullaby. Once the sky clears and the train passes, Akane falls to the ground, defeated but unscathed. She now finds herself in the same abandoned state that she left Auntie in, and this is where the transition between the two of them happens. Auntie has been recognized by Gridman as a human with a heart, whereas Akane is becoming more and more like the kaijus she once created. The shot of Akane running against the train as Gridman flickers across the scene, and the one of Yuta, Utsumi, and Rika all running towards Gridman in the distance stand as 2 of the most visually striking moments, not just in Gridman, but across the series as a whole. The train one especially is one of my all-time favorite shots, with it resembling Akane running in place trying to escape the inevitable in a futile manner. Let's briefly pause on the hyper-analytical side of things to point out one thing I said in the past video. In it, I lightly criticized the reasoning for the trio's realizations of the truth behind the dreams being weak. I don't think this criticism matters anymore. Their reasoning amounts to mostly just waking up so they can wake up Akane. I think these rather simple reasons help reinforce the idea that Akane continues to have less and less control of her own world, given that her own creations are now departing her dreams for their own reasons. And that's the end of this chapter. I think there's a very interesting discussion that could be made about whether the climax of the anime comes with the end of episode 9 or the end of episode 10. There are strong arguments that could be made for either one of these, and honestly I think depending on the mood I'm in when you ask me, I would probably go back and forth on the matter. At the time of writing the script, and probably also while I'm editing the video, I'm currently on the side of episode 9, although if I change my mind, I'm sure I'll rudely pop in from the future to say so. Setting that aside, we're about to enter the final stretch of Gridman. The story has peaked or is about to peak, depending on your perspective, and it's going to be a lot about how the story slowly winds down to a finish and what it means for the characters. Episode 10 begins with Rika revealing the things that Akane has told her. Utsumi has a very difficult time comprehending it all, going from an initial sense of disbelief to deep thought, then eventually being fine. Him being completely fine by the end extends out to the rest of the world as well, as it sets a contrast between Akane coming apart at the seams while the world around her is still functioning and moving along as if nothing ever changed. I adore this brief moment and really wish that the anime doubled down on expanding and exploring it. Yes, it definitely isn't the first moment of that return to normalcy, but it's the one that's clearly stated to be the one that lasts the longest. It's also the first time in which we don't see Akane interacting with any characters outside of Alexis during one of these quieter scenes, which is duly noted during Rika and Yuta's conversation at the shop as the two of them reflect upon the current peace, which is another really good scene too. So given the heavy weight of the previous episode and the noticeable absence of Akane's interactions in the first half of this episode, Ten's moment of peace stands out amongst the rest of the anime. Despite how it initially looks, the kaiju presented in episode 10 of Gridman is by far the most important one in the anime. This episode marks itself apart from the rest once again with another distinct kaiju, or in this case a pair of kaijus. The first is the big pink sock puppet one that ends up being a complete pushover. The first thing of note about it is how it came to be. This is the first time in which a kaiju was created, not because Akane wanted to make one, but because Alexis pushed her into making one. It's another example of Alexis extending its control over Akane's will further and further. This also isn't the only kaiju that was made during this episode. It's one of a handful that Akane made, although each and every one of them are terribly misshapen and lack the precision and details put into all of the previous kaijus. Even the sound this kaiju makes is completely pathetic. It just sounds like a goose on the loose got its wings on a megaphone. She simply picks up one of these without putting much thought into the choice and hands it over to Alexis before she leaves the room. And even though the actual names of the kaijus of the series isn't something I've brought up, nor is it something I'll be bringing up more in the future, I think it's worth mentioning that the official name of this kaiju, according to Wikipedia, is Nanashi, which translates into something along the lines of anonymous, or what I think is a more appropriate word, nameless. This is in contrast to the other kaijus of the series, which have names such as Gurugirasu, Devadadan, Koyabeku, Bajaku, and other more appropriately monstrous names. It's another point of proof of how little Akane put into making Nanashi, given that it doesn't even have a name. I said this kaiju was a pushover earlier, and it really is. It gets blasted once, then kind of falls over and dies, and it doesn't really have a special move or anything that it does. That should serve as an excessive amount of evidence towards the fact that Akane really doesn't care about this kaiju, nor does she care about any kaiju anymore. Birthing itself from the corpse of its original body, the true form of Nanashi appears. The first course of action that it takes involves roaming around the city, not to destroy it, but to dismantle all of the repair kaijus. According to Auntie later on into the episode, this form of Nanashi turns out to be a manifestation of Akane's heart and feelings, so it's important to look at things from that perspective. While the kaiju certainly is reflective of Akane's deepest wills, she has no control over it in any possible way. The first form of Nanashi made things pretty clear that Akane no longer cares about kaijus, but the second form of Nanashi now makes it evident that she no longer cares about her own world. The corpse of the first form just sat there, once defeated after all, and there was no reset that happened, and thanks to the second form, there will be no resets happening in the future. For all intents and purposes, Akane has given up on the city, and moreover, given up on herself, since the city was designed as a safe haven for herself. It's shown through Akane's lack of any significant response to Nanashi's rampage as she quietly walks through the city drowning in her own despair. Yet she expresses some sense of doubt and uncertainty as the second Nanashi roams through the city. As she never expected her city to ever fall into the state that it's currently in, there's no way for her to predict what will happen to it next now that her mechanisms of complete control in the form of the repair kaijus have been torn down. The way that Nanashi fights is much different compared to every other kaiju we've seen. All of the previous ones have been slow, lumbering creatures. This one is incredibly acrobatic and fast, and even displays a very high level of physical strength, seen by how it can rip off parts of full-powered Gridman to strip him back down to regular Gridman. Given that this is still the very same kaiju that is a reflection of Akane's heart, it needs to be viewed through the same lens again. This can very easily be explained as the second Nanashi carrying another aspect of Akane's downward spiral, that being her hate and resentment towards Gridman. The downfall of her city is all his fault, and the kaiju itself embodies this through its relentless attacks. I also want to note that the sound Nanashi makes is also far different from any of the other kaijus of Gridman, with a more unsettling vocalization that sounds more like some kind of distorted laughter than a monster's roar, as if Alexis is mocking Akane as he watches her city crumble before her eyes. The most likely reason as to why the second Nanashi was even inside of the first one to begin with was almost certainly a complete accident. You can see that the general shape of the second Nanashi always existed within the first, with a pointed head that looks like something's about to pop out of it. And it's not something that was formed after the defeat of the first. The guess that I had in my previous video, which I still hold to this day, is that Akane was simply brimming with negative emotions while creating this kaiju, that it inevitably spilled out into the kaiju during its creation, incubating the second Nanashi within the first. During the bit of downtime between the two Nanashis, an interesting interaction that occurs is when Akane meets Auntie face to face again for the first time in a little while. The very clear takeaway from this is that the position between the two of them have swapped. Auntie, despite how much he's wanted to prove that he is nothing but a kaiju, fails to be recognized as one by both Gridman and Akane. I'm not going to try and justify Gridman's perspective here, mostly because I don't have an answer to it, besides the fact that Auntie looks like a human half the time. Going by what my subtitles told me, Gridman doesn't fight living things, and kaijus aren't living things since they are manifestations of Akane's negative emotions. Auntie has transcended those emotions to become fully living, which again I don't really understand, but that's alright since Gridman's perspective on Auntie isn't as important as Akane's. Akane gives us not one, not two, but 3 reasons on what makes a kaiju. They cannot read feelings, they don't go out of their way to help people, and they ruin people's lives by existing. For almost every kaiju we've seen so far, this holds true, but this gets more intriguing when you take those 3 reasons and apply it to Akane herself. Akane hasn't read anyone's feelings for a long time because her entire world and almost all of her actions within it have been motivated by her own needs and wants and nothing else, with very little consideration for others. In a similar vein, she's very rarely helped people, and she's also ruined many lives. This is, all things considered, a rather straightforward comparison that can be made. But what I like about this scene the most is that Akane is aware of this fact. Akane comments that Auntie has eyes like a person, and when Auntie is about to comment on what Akane's eyes look like, she cuts him off and looks down. So if Auntie, who was previously a kaiju and is now a human, has eyes like a person, then Akane, who was ostensibly a human, must have eyes like a... well, I'm sure we all get it by now. I'll admit that the significance behind the scene is rather obvious, but I think it's done quite well. There really isn't a point to dancing around the subject matter of what Akane has become, especially with how much more of a focus it becomes in the following episode. Auntie was specifically designed by Akane to act as a counter to Gridman. The thing that would allow him to do this was to mirror any and all of Gridman's moves, which was created to future-proof Auntie against any of the new transformations Gridman would acquire as the episodes progressed. However, Auntie ends up mimicking Gridman to such a degree that he turns into almost a carbon copy of Gridman, being given the title of Grid Knight once it does happen. While Auntie does say something about how in order to crush Gridman, he's going to join forces with him, given that the thing that he's fighting at the moment of his transformation just happens to be the manifestation of Akane's heart, I think there's more to it. It ties back to the conversation between Akane and Auntie earlier on in the episode about how kaijus don't understand feelings, yet since Auntie is no longer a kaiju according to Akane, he has been able to comprehend feelings, or at the very least, how Akane feels. Both Akane and Auntie were haunted by Gridman, albeit in different ways, and his existence alone brought both of them to their lowest points, whether that's being abandoned by your creator or being abandoned by your creations. Auntie would be the only person in the anime truly capable of being able to understand Akane's sentiment towards Gridman, and this understanding allows him to overcome his own crushingly negative emotions towards Gridman during his fight against Nanashi, hence why he transforms to Grid Knight. Once everything has concluded, Akane has nothing left. She's given up on her kaijus, she's given up on her own world, and she's given up on herself. Even Nanashi, her unintentionally most powerful creation, failed to defeat Gridman thanks to Auntie's intervention. Defeating Gridman at this point does almost certainly nothing, or at least nothing that she's aware of. So once she locates the base of operations and learns of the truth behind Gridman after the collapse of her city and mental state, the only reaction she has to this is to stab Yuta. While yes, science has proven that being stabbed is not good, Akane stabbing Yuta here is such a petty and inconsequential amount of damage compared to the scale of destruction and the loss of lives Akane has been responsible for throughout the events of Gridman. It really is a testament to how far she has fallen, and honestly might be the single best example of portraying this downfall. As far as miscellaneous things in 10 are concerned, there are 2. The first is that in the first half of the episode, Akane has a nightmare haunted by all of her victims. This is the first time in the anime that Akane has been reminded of them in a way that doesn't involve her parading her own past successes. It's interesting that this comes in now once she's accepted her own defeat. This sequence also makes it clear that while we've only seen Akane kill a handful of people on screen, there are many casualties that are never shown. Whether that's a result of deaths unintentionally caused by the rampaging kaijus or previous attacks that happened before the events of Gridman, or both, is something we can't confirm, but the death toll is certainly up there. Since there is no place to run and no kaijus that can defeat Gridman anymore, her actions have finally caught up to her. The second involves the big twist involving the reveal of the inside of Akane's house that is cool but has nothing really done with it. That being said, I honestly think this is okay. It establishes the fact that Akane is unreachable in her current state, not for a lack of trying, but because they physically can't get to her room. Her room being completely normal adds to the intrigue of this as well, while supporting the idea that she can't be reached in that isolated location. That marks the end of our duo of very densely packed episodes, and things are going to start powering down for Gridman, so let's now take a look at episode 11. Akane refuses to create more kaijus at the behest of Alexis, so he makes do by reviving the fallen kaijus of the past. This is good as another way of making Akane see her past actions again, and the only real criticism I would have for it is that I wish we got to see a bit more on this fight from Akane's perspective. But given that she has lost interest in both the kaijus and the city, I understand there wouldn't be much input from her behalf by this point. The only thing she says during this time is along the lines of, "What's the point of fighting?" Given that Akane has experienced almost exclusively defeat throughout the anime, it's not too surprising to hear that she sees no point in fighting anymore, whereas if this question were to be posed to any of the other characters, I'm sure they'd have a wildly different answer. Another thing to note is that the second form of Nanashi doesn't show up during this fight. Maybe this has something to do with the fact that it was defeated by Grid Knight and not Gridman, but I like to think that it being a manifestation of Akane's heart meant that it was fueled by the intensity of her negative emotions, but now that the intensity has burnt out, there's nothing to power it anymore. The other kaijus were all created for a specific purpose that didn't carry the same level of emotional intensity as the second Nanashi, meaning that they could be revived without the same level of negative emotions needed. It's just my theory on it anyways. Now that we've come this far into Gridman, let's finally take the time to have a more proper look at Rika and how her character stands against Akane within the context of the world they exist in. Despite some of the visible existential dread that Rika was feeling after Akane revealed the truth a few episodes ago, she has come to terms with it, as seen in episode 9. The conversation between Rika and Akane here in 10 not only provides another interesting look into the relationship between creator and creation, but also acts as a good point to look at the polarizing contrasts set by the two characters. Akane attempts to fully dismiss Rika after she approaches by saying that what's happening right now doesn't involve Rika. Akane is incorrect in two ways. Firstly, in an attempt to perfect her world, Akane sacrificed the lives of countless people, so to simply say that her creations don't matter in the grand scheme of things is a very narrow-minded view. Secondly, Rika presents herself as the most grounded character in the entirety of Gridman, which puts her in the polar opposite position of where Akane lies. She's the only character with family and friends that is actively being shown and interacted with consistently, whereas Akane has nobody in the city to keep herself tied to it. Rika also is by far the most ordinary character that doesn't show any outstanding traits or expertise on something, placing her at the far extreme of Akane's creator-god status. One of Rika's key characteristics is that she's always looking after people, whether that's Yuta during Gridman's fight or Hasen Namiko once the fights have concluded. She's also shown to be the character that shows the most concern and distress during and after these attacks. As the anime progresses, Rika's attention is directed towards Akane as she loses more and more control of her own world and spirals deeper down into her depression. And even though this last point isn't relevant until the final episode, despite being a creation of Akane's and all the support for her that Rika has shown throughout the anime, Rika is the one to make the most impactful decision by telling Akane to leave this universe once and for all at the end, and to return to the real world. Therefore, because of how closely Rika is tied to this world and how she interacts with Akane, to say that she isn't involved with the current situation is completely incorrect. However, it is worth considering that Akane's narrow-minded perspective still continues even after the collapse of her own world. Despite how far she's fallen, she still hasn't changed her perspective in regards to her own creations, and this is all due to the one thing that animes always boil down to, the power of friendship, of course. While Rika may view Akane as her friend as a result of either being created as such, actually believing in the friendship, or both, we've never had the opportunity to consider the same question from Akane's perspective. Akane has never come forth to mention whether or not she is Rika's friend. Whenever the two are together and the topic of friendship is brought up, all Akane always says is that Rika was made to be Akane's friend. When Rika finally asks the question back to Akane, it certainly does seem to cause Akane to hesitate and genuinely consider the question. Throughout all of Gridman, there have only been two people that have truly cared for Akane, Rika and Auntie. This realization hits Akane at that moment as well, at least in considering Rika. But as Akane is about to answer the question, Alexis arrives to interrupt her, so we never get to hear the answer here. I think the timing of this moment is incredibly well done, as Akane is finally about to open up and show a change of heart for once. Alexis, the being who has been puppeteering her from the shadows and exerting more and more control with each episode, ignores this moment in its entirety in order to create another kaiju to reveal the true monster of the story. Even though I loved Alexis's timing and the twist of transforming Akane into a kaiju in the previous episode, I really wish that the anime took the opportunity to do something more with Akane's kaiju form. It's visually distinct from a lot of the mechanical designs, and while the rocky texture draws a lot of similarities to the mountain kaiju of episode 5, I think that the more organic aspect of Akane's kaijus, such as the tentacles and the beak containing the mask, help distinguish it apart from that one. The sound design on it is phenomenal, with how its cries are distorted versions of Akane's screams, and when combining both its audio-visual components with the context tied to it, Episode 12's kaiju becomes my vote for the most memorable in the entirety of the Gridman universe. The irony of Akane directly taking part in the destruction of her own city after having several kaijus do the job is fantastically disturbing. Furthermore, even the interior of the kaiju is different. When the past kaijus were cut open in one way or another, they always depicted the same interior with the colorful wiring. Akane's kaiju is completely dark inside, with victims of Akane's past coming back to haunt her again, and it's all but confirmed that the hands holding her down are further representations or manifestations of her victims. The anime really put a lot into this kaiju to make sure that a kaiju born of human emotions and one born purely from a human are completely different entities. Given that the final fight was meant to be the grand showdown between Gridman and Alexis, I guess the lack of expansion upon Akane's kaiju form is understandable, but it's unfortunate that that's how the circumstances turned out to be. Once Akane has been transformed and starts wreaking havoc throughout the city, Rika and Alexis have a little chat. After Rika makes her usual claim of being Akane's friend, Alexis goes on about how irrelevant her existence is in the grand scheme of things, being one of Akane's creations that merely believes that they are human and that they are friends with Akane. While this is all great in terms of setting the mood for the upcoming fight and whatnot, it's no accident that their conversation is happening as the anime is showing shots of Grid Knight fighting Akane. Anti is very much in the same vein as Rika in the way Alexis describes them. Anti was a creation of Akane's that so intensely believed, even if he went on to show human qualities time and again, falling into the same descriptors that Alexis assigns to Akane's human creations. Once the fight is over and Alexis has been sealed away, Akane and Rika have one last conversation. It's interesting to note that Rika doesn't forgive the things that Akane has done, but is accepting of all the things that Akane claims that she is, such as being cowardly or weak. I view this as Rika not justifying or rationalizing Akane's actions in the past, but understanding the circumstances Akane was pushed into, and that these actions were a consequence of her lashing out. Akane was so dejected by the real world that she hid herself in a world of her own creation, and that the destruction and death she wrought was a result of her not wanting to replicate the real world. This spiraled out of control once Gridman came to the picture, and especially once Akane started exerting more and more power. In the past video, one piece of criticism I laid against this scene was that Akane hadn't done anything to deserve her redemption. I don't think this statement matters anymore, because the scene was never about any kind of redemption to begin with. Rika delivers the final and most important message of Gridman through her final conversation with Akane. You are not alone. The entire story came to be because Akane had lost control of her own self and emotions, spiraling away deeper and deeper into this depressive obsession until it consumes and destroys both herself and her entire world. Rather than seeking help from those around her that would have been very willing to help her, she instead allows herself to be taken over by her own negative emotions and Alexis Carib. Akane understands that her mistakes and that the damage done, even with Gridman's best efforts in healing the city, is irreversible. The fact that the final reset to the city is done by Gridman, the villain to Akane's story that she so strongly desired to defeat, killing God knows how many people in her attempts, is effectively the nail in the coffin. The people she killed will never come back, so instead of seeking redemption and forgiveness from her own creations for the irreversible damage, Akane must learn from her mistakes and move on, and the only way to do that is to wake up and face the real world again. I loved the ending to Gridman in the past, and I love it even more now. Despite the energetic and fast-moving nature of the main fight of the episode, things end on a melancholy note as Akane leaves her world behind and her world moves on without her. There's the sharp contrast between the peak in the show's energy being quickly followed by the most quiet and peaceful scene in the entire series. There's no attempt to sugarcoat what Akane has done in the past to try and carve out some sort of happy ending to everyone. The episodes leading up to 12 were all just as gloomy and dark, and the ending reflects that very well by leaving things on a hopeful yet bitter note. The commitment to this tone that persisted throughout the best parts of Gridman is one of the main reasons why it has lingered so deeply in my mind for all this time after having finished it. And yeah, that's it for SSSS.Gridman. You're probably a little too aware of this fact by now, but I love this anime. Nothing else, even Dynazenon, comes close to how much I enjoyed this. Rewatching or rereading something purely for entertainment's sake is something I've been very weary of for a very long time, since all of the events are predictable, which makes getting through the story to get to the climactic parts a chore for me. But it absolutely wasn't the case here. If anything, I enjoyed SSSS.Gridman even more on my second time through, since all of my attention went to everything between the fights. This second time really helped me realize what made the anime stick with me for so long and why it still continues to impress me far more than any other anime I've seen. I still don't feel like I was able to do that intangible quality to the dialogue and atmosphere of the series proper justice, and as weird as this is going to sound, maybe that's a good thing. I don't think it's a quality that should be categorized or defined in a specific way because of how free and natural these moments feel. I know it's ironic of me to say this given the length of this video, but I don't think you need a reason for enjoying something. If you know you enjoyed it, then that's a good enough reason on its own, and you don't need to justify it to anyone. And that's exactly how I feel about that quality of Gridman. For almost everything else in the anime, I can tell you specific reasons as to why I did or didn't like that aspect of it. But for that intangible quality, I can't quite nail the reason on the head except for the fact that I love it, and maybe that really is the only reason I need. When I played Left 4 Dead 2 for the first time, I really did not like it. The gameplay felt tedious with having to manage my ammo and health packs, and the game throwing hundreds upon hundreds of zombies at me with the occasional special variant got really stale for me very quickly. I'm not a huge fan of shooter games in general, but the only shooter game I sunk a considerable amount of hours into before Left 4 Dead 2 was Warframe. Your player character moves around so much more quickly and ammo management is basically non-existent, and there was a far greater variety in enemy types and weapons that made the game feel consistently entertaining during my first couple hundred hours with the game. But when I came back to Left 4 Dead 2 after having not played it for a while, I found myself enjoying the game a lot more than I did the first time. Maybe it's because I got good, or at least got a little better, but once I came to terms with the fact that the game was fundamentally built different compared to Warframe, the game became much more enjoyable for me. Ammo management didn't feel so bad anymore when I became more comfortable with using my primary without stressing over the ammo after each and every shot. Health pack management also felt better once I realized that the best way to keep your health up is just to kill as much shit as possible instead of running away and swatting things back. I'm sure most of you guys will have realized by now where this very specific and contrived excuse of a transition is heading, because this is the exact same way that I feel about Gridman versus Dynazenon. The first time I watched Dynazenon all the way through, I was honestly a little disappointed. It had qualities that I really liked, but it just wasn't anything like Gridman aside from some of the more obvious aspects, like the big robots and the kaijus. But there was always something about the anime that felt iffy to me. To say that it was nothing like its predecessor would be a bit of an exaggeration, but the fact that the statement even popped up into my head should indicate that there are some very significant differences between the two. And this isn't anything like just different characters or different stories. That is true, of course it's true. But Dynazenon has an entirely different structure to how many aspects of it are organized and presented. It's like there was a shift in philosophy where you would keep the key aspects of the predecessor, such as the interactions and the fight scenes, but build an entirely new and unique experience around that. The following statement is something I told myself very frequently in the weeks and days leading up to the airing of Dynazenon's first episode. This is not Gridman. It was a self-employed measure to try and hold back my own hype, alongside avoiding every trailer and preview I could. I'm not someone that really focuses on what's about to come out and instead usually pays attention to what is out, or more often than not, what has been out. Dynazenon was one of the very few exceptions to this since I couldn't help myself because I loved Gridman so much. And I think that trying to resist getting too hyped for Dynazenon ended up worsening the situation since whatever was going to come out better be as amazing as Gridman if I'm having to hold myself back like this. When directly comparing Gridman and Dynazenon, there is one specific thing that Dynazenon does much, much worse than Gridman. This became the focal point of the show for me on my first time through. Despite some of these strengths I saw in it, Dynazenon was being held back so heavily by that one specific thing that I couldn't help but feel let down by it. By the time I was about to start my second viewing, I was more comfortable admitting that the perspective I held onto during my first viewing wasn't a helpful one. With how definitive the ending of Gridman is, there was never going to be any way for any installment in the same universe to replicate exactly the same things Gridman did well. Even though Dynazenon and Gridman share similarities and are connected, I think they should be viewed in two separate bubbles. The way each story is built is so different from one another that it simply isn't fair to expect one to replicate the successes of the other, when they were never meant to replicate each other aside from their most defining qualities. What you're about to see is very different from what we've been looking at for the first half of this video. And before we finally begin, I'm going to leave you with this message. The central theme of Dynazenon is closure, or rather the lack thereof. It's about the fact that stories will have loose ends, incomplete answers, and unsatisfactory endings. It's about coming to terms with the endings to your own stories, even if the endings to them weren't what you wanted and you so desperately chased after every little thing that could change the outcome in even the slightest of ways. And ultimately, it's about how you respond to the endings that you're given. Ladies and gentlemen, let us begin again, for this is SSSS.Dynazenon, a truly worthy sequel. We can already begin to notice significant differences between Dynazenon and Gridman just by glancing at the first episode. For Gridman's first episode, the thing I kept going on and on about was the incoherency of it all. Episode 1 of Dynazenon absolutely doesn't carry the same kind of unsettling, incoherent weirdness that Gridman does. In fact, I'd go as far as saying that the episode is almost normal, or as normal as a series about giant robots fighting giant dinosaurs can be. Anyways, it's still a stark contrast to Gridman's story. And I like this a lot. Dynazenon ultimately ends up telling a very different story compared to Gridman, and in a very different manner as well. The sheer difference in the openings between the two is a good way to establish this difference. As I mentioned in the earlier prologue, when I first watched Dynazenon, I went into it expecting something similar to Gridman and found myself feeling let down when Dynazenon wasn't reflecting some of the same qualities as Gridman. But that's the entire point, and a very important one too. To contrast the normalcy, I really like the extent to which the anime goes out of its way in the first episode to make Gauma stick out like a sore thumb. Aside from his visual design, his animations are also far more aggressive and, well, animated, compared to every other character in this episode and almost every other character throughout the remainder of the anime. The anime going this far to make Gauma stick out is great, not only to make him seem more interesting and upping the weirdness of his appearance, but because of how well integrated he becomes to the core cast of the entire story of Dynazenon. Setting him in such an extremely outlying position at the very start makes the way that he settles into the story give his character a more profound and impactful impression by the end, which we'll get to later, quite later. I'll just quickly mention that Gauma is the direct reincarnation of an entity from the original Gridman show known as The Mummy. The subtitles I watched had a mistranslation in episode 11 where Yomogi says the word Mira, which the subtitles translated as mirror instead of mummy. I thought it was a little funny, but I guess we do need to get back to the actual video at some point. One way that you can describe the story of Dynazenon is that it's busy. This isn't meant to be derogatory, nor is it meant to be complimentary. It's just me trying to be as objective as possible about describing it. Dynazenon has a lot of different moving pieces to its story, to a point that the word story singular might not be the most accurate way of describing the situation at hand. Discussing it as Dynazenon's stories, plural, would probably be a more apt way of going about things. Throughout almost the entirety of the anime, you will find the episodes swapping between stories regularly in order to provide progression for each of them and their respective characters, with this progression per episode ranging anywhere from insignificant to invaluable. This is already a massive change from the storytelling of Gridman, which focused on a single tightly constructed story from start to finish with very little deviations throughout the entire duration once you enter the second half. The perspective of the story changes, with Akane becoming an increasingly heavier point of focus with each passing episode. Dynazenon choosing to tell a wider collection of stories compared to Gridman's focus on a singular one results in an interesting change, which we will preview by looking at episode 1. In hindsight, it's really easy to notice the things that are brought up in this episode that remain consistently relevant throughout the remainder of the anime. We can begin with Yomogi and how he views and feels about his current family dynamic. Episode 1 puts a good bit of emphasis on it, especially with how it shows Yomogi having tossed the gift away into the donation box. It's a very clear indication of some kind of dissatisfaction and general unhappiness with the entire situation. Looking outside of Yomogi, I think Yume started off strongly here as well. The scene of her going into her sister Kano's room to get something while her parents are arguing in the background creates a solid point to kick things off of, especially followed by the shot of the family surrounding Kano's dead body at around the 11-minute, 11-second mark in the episode. Koyomi and Chise are introduced as well, although the screen time they're given in episode 1 is nowhere near as deep or personal as Yomogi or Yume's, but even then this lack of gravity in their interaction distinctly sets them apart from the other two. Gauma's introduction is about as lame as it gets, with him keeled over on the floor starving, barely scraping by thanks to some charity out of Yomogi. Outside of purely character-related shenanigans, there's also the fight, which takes up roughly the last 6 minutes of the episode. So that's a hell of a way to start off episode 1, because it's a lot of details, specifically in regards to Yomogi and Yume, and even though Koyomi, Chise, and Gauma don't have the same kind of depth or detail to their introductions as the other two, it's the lack of this depth and detail that still helps these characters feel more distinct. But while this episode is densely packed with the beginnings of a lot of stories, some of these stories are more of a story than others. Throughout the entirety of Dynazenon, the two stories that are given the most attention to by a significant margin are those belonging to Yume and Koyomi, especially the former. Yomogi has a good start in episode 1 with how his views on his family are portrayed, but this is barely explored throughout the rest of the anime. Most of his character arc is tied very closely to Yume, but he doesn't have all that much to support himself from a standalone perspective. There is a little something in episode 8, and as is tradition for the nth time in this video, we'll get to that when we do. The reason why I really wanted to see more out of this aspect of Yomogi from episode 1 is because Yume and Koyomi's stories are very firmly rooted in the past, and having a story that is more grounded in the present could have made for a good contrast and another way to make Yomogi's character feel just that little bit more unique. I could say the same for Yume to a far lesser extent as well, in that I wish her relationship to her parents was explored over the course of the story, since similar to Yomogi, I think the episode creates a solid starting spot. However, I am far less critical about this aspect of Yume's character since the anime expands upon her relationship with their sister Kano very greatly, so she has something of significance and substance to support herself. Chise basically has nothing going on for her until episode 9, which creates a very interesting plot point for her, but this plot point doesn't see much expansion after that episode. Gauma is in an awkward spot because while his backstory isn't all that important in the long run and he doesn't really have an ongoing story arc to follow either, he ends up being the most important character in the entire anime and in the simplest manner as well, just because of his presence being there. So while these stories are left by the wayside, the one about Yume and her sister and Koyomi's regrets gets several episodes dedicated to them with multiple wildly varying perspectives contributing to the overall story, all supported by a very distinct sense of progression. So hopefully now things are a little more clear, or maybe even a little less clear, about when I say that Dynazenon is busy. It has so many little pieces that aren't conflicting with one another, but certainly are bumping up against each other as they want to get their own little bits of development. I think the choice to dedicate most of the anime to two of the strongest stories, rather than trying to split time evenly across more stories, was the correct decision, because it results in the anime telling two great stories surrounded by a group of less impressive ones, rather than a larger collection of simply okay stories that don't feel finished. While I still prefer the way that Gridman chose to handle its storytelling, that's not to discredit or take anything away from the style present in Dynazenon. One of the pieces of criticism I laid against Gridman was the nature of its action sequences to have novelty without longevity. So how does the action in Dynazenon size up to its counterpart? Well, it's definitely better, but that's because of a fundamental difference in both the structure of the action and the approach taken in choreographing these scenes. The structure of action in Dynazenon differs because instead of having only one character that the fight is based around, we now have four. We have Gauma with Dyna Diver, Yume with Dyna Wing, Koyomi with Dyna Striker, and Yomogi with Dyna Soldier. They can come together to form Combine Dragon Dynazenon, which has an alternate form called Super Dragon Dyna Rex. As there are now 4 people responsible for the action compared to the 1, sometimes 2 of Gridman, numerous action scenes throughout the anime become about more than just the action. The way these fights are structured requires character interactions for them to work because of how important cooperation becomes, and there are 2 fights that represent this really nicely, those being the ones in episodes 2 and 3. These fights are both very, very good. This isn't because of the quality of the animation or anything, because that's always been outstanding across each and every fight throughout the entire series. The difference in the confidence levels between each of the characters is great in that it enables character interaction in a unique way that Gridman was never able to do in its fights, and this can be attributed solely to the core difference in the structure of action between the 2 shows. To quickly highlight character interaction in this context, I'd say that the most important aspect of these interactions within the fight scenes would be if they either reveal something new about a character or if it changes the relationship between the characters in some way. The way the action is set up and executed in Gridman allows for pretty much 0 opportunities of interesting character interactions during them, since Yuta as Gridman is the only person consistently involved in the action. There are different members that jump in and out to help him during each of the fights, but once they combine, they essentially turn into a single entity, and that's the end of almost all opportunities for interactions. Yes, there is very occasionally some banter thrown around, but I don't really count this because there's already plenty of similar stuff throughout the series, and taking this out of the action wouldn't really change anything. The most interaction that happened during any bit of Gridman that I can think of would be in the very first episode, when there is some communication that goes back and forth between Yuta and Gridman and Narika and Utsumi at the shop. On the contrary, the action in Dynazenon is set up so that almost every single character needs to be involved in almost every single fight. The full combine can only happen if all 4 of the pilots are there after all. So whether you like it or not, character interactions naturally need to happen since each character is acting mostly independently before the combine actually happens. I think that the fight in episode 2 is the best example throughout the entirety of Dynazenon to highlight this key difference between the 2 animes, and it's a good example of that too. The absolute lack of confidence Yomogi possesses in his ability to pilot Dyna Soldier is made hilariously clear by all the spinning and turning he does without accomplishing anything, while Koyomi is doing mid-air 360s with Striker and Yume flies by with the airstrikes on Wing. The disparity is great, and I wish we got to see more of it throughout the anime, with Yomogi struggling to keep up with everyone else's combat capabilities due to his obligations with real life, but I understand that this isn't something that can be lingered on for too long since it would start sacrificing other bits of story and character progression. We can further see the continued importance of this change in structure by jumping into episode 3's fight. The key takeaway from this entire episode is the mention that Dynazenon's full combine can't happen if everyone's heart isn't on the same page. Yeah, this falls right into the same cheesy anime-ness of something like The Power of Friendship or My Grandpa's Deck Has No Pathetic Cards, Kaiba, but what this deck of that shit's so dumb. But what this deck of cards does have is the addition of bonus context to some of the fights throughout Dynazenon. Later on in the anime, almost every single fight ends up involving the fully combined Dynazenon or something even further beyond that. But within the first half, there's a lot of fighting that happens as split parts, with combinations only happening if the kaiju of the week is powerful enough to deem it necessary. The combinations that do happen during the first half only happen because, like Gamma says in episode 3, everyone's heart is on the same page and their feelings are united. Take for example episode 1, this is everyone's first attempt at piloting Dynazenon, and all things considered it goes pretty well, although it does kind of seem like Gamma is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Dynazenon also appears in its fully combined state, although whether this is a default setting or if it detected the feelings around itself and combined in advance is impossible to know as far as I'm concerned. Anyways, it maintains its combined form and is piloted successfully because during that moment, everyone would be feeling very similar emotions, probably a mix of confusion and fear, because they got picked up into this robot that popped up out of nowhere, followed by fighting some sort of giant monster that's been wrecking the city. Even if these aren't positive emotions, it still acts as a united feeling. Episode 2's Combine goes mostly without a hitch because even though Yomogi is falling behind in his piloting capabilities, everyone's heart is still in the right place, since there's a kaiju that needs defeating and there are no internal problems within the group that might cause splintered feelings. Which leads us into episode 3, where we have those splintered feelings. The appearance of the kaiju eugenicists, fun word, and them calling out Galma as a betrayer, has Yomogi, Yume, and Koyomi feeling uncertain about whether they should believe Galma or the eugenicists' side of the story. And since they can't put their faith in Galma due to his refusal to expand upon his side of the story, Dynazenon is unable to combine as a result because the two are feeling differently about their situation than Galma is. The combination only occurs as a result of Galma conceding and revealing his reason for fighting, which everyone else accepts, joining Galma's feelings in the process to proceed with the combine. Fast forwarding to episode 6, this episode provides evidence to suggest the idea that the unity of feelings not only allows for the combine to happen, but also empowers Dynazenon afterwards. In that episode, Yomogi, Yume, and Koyomi have all gone through some, let's say, less than ideal events in their lives, so while their hearts might be in the right place to allow for the combine to happen, the three of them are too distracted and or distraught by those events that just happened to them for them to commit themselves to the action, hence why Dynazenon is very weak during that fight. There's a cool detail from the voice acting aspect of the fight, since the usual battle cry they do at the start of every fight isn't synchronized this time, with Yomogi and Galma also being the only two to say it. After that hurdle, however, the combining process is never threatened, since it seems that they've finally crossed the line where there is always unity in their feelings. As a matter of fact, the combinations in the latter half of Dynazenon proceed to get increasingly ridiculous in terms of scale and name as each episode goes by, which only further cements the fact. So that should hopefully be sufficient evidence towards showing the impact of having more people being consistently in the action and how the increase to interesting interactions also changes the fight around itself. Moving away from the contextual side of things, let's also look at the visual side of these fights, more specifically in the approach to choreography that was taken. The best way for me to describe how the action progresses in Dynazenon is that it gets absolutely stupid as hell. But god, this shit can be so much fun to watch despite how stupid it gets sometimes. The best example of this is in episode 3, when they kidnap the kaiju and take it to outer space, or in episode 7, where Dynazenon does a spinning flip onto the back of a kaiju to pummel it, then take it for a ride. This should go without saying, but Dynazenon doesn't need to go for a spinning flip onto the back of a kaiju to pummel it and go for a ride, but it does anyways, and I am so fucking glad that it does. Just how ridiculous some of this stuff gets keeps the action so much more refreshing, since it seems like the people behind choreographing these fights were determined to make sure they would constantly one-up the last one and weren't worried about holding back in any way during the process. This fixes the issue of having novelty without longevity, because this spirit of one-upmanship throughout Dynazenon essentially causes the anime to start overdosing on novelty. I genuinely can't emphasize enough how the anime manages to keep outperforming itself in each and every fight during its latter half, with it culminating to an incredibly satisfying fight at the end. The fights in Gridman technically do have this same approach of fights trying to outdo the ones that preceded themselves, but this time it's a more predictable and linear growth compared to the volatile and exponential growth present in Dynazenon. It's basically impossible for me to say whether the change in this magnitude of approach was a direct response to Gridman's linear growth, a happy consequence of increased budget or scope, something that was only possible within the circumstances of Dynazenon, or maybe a combination of some or all of those factors. All that being said, the actual reason behind this change doesn't really matter to me when the resulting product ended up being so fantastic. I strongly emphasized in the first half of the video that Gridman could be divided into two halves rather cleanly. I'm sure I also strongly emphasized that strong emphasis itself at some point, but if I didn't, I guess I just strongly did now. Anyways, the reason I bring it up again here is because Dynazenon can't be divided in the same way. In fact, it's really difficult to divide Dynazenon episodically in any way that is as clean as Gridman. This is entirely because of the tendency for stories to phase in and out of episodes, with each of them being at completely different points of progression during the same episode. So for the following few chapters, we're going to be jumping back and forth between the two stories of Koyome and Yumi, all while mixing in the occasional other stories that we need. It's going to be a little busy, but then again, so is the anime. Another consequence of this difference in storytelling that isn't as significant as the previous point is that because there is more that needs to be told, there isn't exactly the same amount of spatial luxury as in Gridman to fill with extended stretches of dialogue. In fact, what you end up getting is shorter but more frequent bursts of dialogue, or this kind of dialogue being woven into the actual story scenes themselves. An example of how Dynazenon immediately carries over this wonderful quality of the dialogue in a different style of presentation from Gridman is in episode 1 with Yomugi's circle of friends and how they're made a focal point from the literal very start. I think something really cool about this opening is that within the group, there are multiple overlapping conversations. It isn't a huge deal or anything, but I still think it's really neat in the sense that it gives Yomugi's small group, as ultimately irrelevant as they are, a bit more personality. There's a similar trend of these bits and pieces of interactions that happen between a wide variety of characters, with examples of those being sprinkled consistently throughout episodes 2 through 5. These are almost all of no significance, but I still like them a lot. Yume looks like she's genuinely having fun with Mei, which is in stark contrast to her usually stoic mannerisms. Yomugi shows priority for his job over everything else, even after witnessing the damage done to the city in person, all while throwing some friendly banter back and forth with his co-worker Inamoto. Chise and Koyomi try to figure out whether or not piloting Dyna's striker counts as being employed. Galma breaking and entering Yomugi's house and bathroom, but Yomugi's mom is perfectly okay with it since she is too nice. Again, these short scenes aren't of much significance, but I adore them due to my love for how characters interact in the series, and I would be remiss if I didn't point out some of the examples present in Dynazenon. One of the more significant differences between Dynazenon and Gridman is that in Dynazenon, the world doesn't reset after each and every attack like it did back in Gridman. Episode 2 does a really good job at highlighting this in a few ways. Firstly, the attack has impacted the city's transportation, and the school schedule has been affected accordingly. While this is an incredibly minor thing, it's something that still stood out to me as a way that the people in Dynazenon's world responded to the damage done to it, since that lack of recognition is something unique about Gridman. The more obvious example is Yume and Yomugi visiting the site that they fought in during the prior episode, with buildings crushed and toppled in every which way and the road turned into rubble. Aside from that allowing for further differentiation between the two animes, it also serves another purpose in giving Yume and Yomugi a decently grounded spot to begin building motivation upon. I think this is really nice. It's rather humble and actually establishes stakes that the characters need to face, and just goes on to emphasize the more grounded aspects of Dynazenon's overall story. It's a real shame then that this fact is barely ever touched upon again. Scenes of construction are still here and there, but there's nothing that really looks at the subject matter again like episode 2 does. Now, I'm not saying that I would have liked more scenes like that in episode 2 where they really zoom in on the fact that the destruction sticks around. I understand why Dynazenon chose not to focus on it, since the world not resetting isn't that big of a deal here compared to Gridman, where the world resetting was an absolutely massive deal. And maybe it's that stark difference between the two animes that makes me want to see attention given to both sides of the situation. Again, this is one of those things that left me a bit disappointed with Dynazenon when I watched it for the first time. From episodes 2 through 5, Dynazenon introduces Yume and Koyomi's stories as well as establishing a solid foundation for them as well. I think both of these are done well, and done well in different manners too. Both of their stories are about viewing the character in question from multiple different perspectives. Yume's story revolves around her deceased sister Kano and how well Kano's past clubmates knew her, with each of them providing a different speck of information and a new perspective to chase after. Koyomi's story revolves around himself, and mostly about how he views himself, with perspectives from characters like Inamoto and Mujina also impacting his own outlook. Kano's story is very externalized in the sense that all the details for it are spread wide and thin across a multitude of characters, many of whom we only see once throughout all of Dynazenon. Koyomi's story is very internalized, where most, if not all, of the details surrounding the changes in his character are sourced from his own interpretation, of other people's perspectives. This contrast is great, and I really enjoy how Dynazenon is able to compile two very different stories simultaneously in two very different manners as well, that never feels clunky or contrived. Episode 4 marks the beginnings of Yomogi's feelings towards Yume, which is something that I really liked about Dynazenon. Yuta had this a bit with Rika during Gridman, and while what's portrayed during Gridman's episode 4 is good stuff, it doesn't get touched on at all after that episode outside of a cheeky mention of it during the final episode before Gridman pieces out. While this episode isn't necessarily super heavy on this aspect, as it's mentioned a bit during the first half and at the very end, it's more than made up by the fact that it's something that's continuously touched upon throughout multiple episodes, with it clearly impacting and changing the way that Yomogi interacts with Yume. It makes for interesting long-term characterization that amounts to something meaningful by the very end, and is one of the main reasons why I would say Yomogi is a far better protagonist than Yuta. One thing that also helps this aspect in this episode is the way that Inamoto interacts with Yomogi about the whole thing, since she can clearly read him like a book despite his best efforts. I think Inamoto is a solid character since all of her interactions with Yomogi are really good thanks to how well she seems to know him, but we'll talk more about her in a bit. To expand a little more on what I just said, I think that Yomogi is a noticeably better main protagonist compared to Yuta. The thing that helps the most is that Yuta is used to drive the story along, while Yomogi is just a normal character. Almost everything Yuta does in Gridman is designed to serve the story in some way, whether that's meeting Anocilius II in episode 6, breaking out of the dream in episode 9, or realizing his true identity in episode 11. As a result, the anime doesn't leave a whole lot of time or space for Yuta to develop as a character. It's here and there, like when he interacts with Rika in episodes 4 and 10, but nothing truly substantial amounts from it, something that you can point to and confidently say that yes, this is his character arc. Yomogi, on the other hand, has the romance aspect to his character that provides a slow and steady arc, but outside of this, he's also shown to be a much more integrated character. His first appearance is characterized by him bantering with a group of friends that we see a couple more times through the rest of the anime, but he also has a mother and a grandmother that appear a few times. It doesn't sound all that impressive, but this means that he's allowed to take part in that natural and unforced style of interactions that is so core to the series from the beginning. The anime doesn't need to take the time to carve out a spot for Yomogi like they need to for Yuta. A lot of Yuta's early interactions are designed to reinforce the uncanny atmosphere rather than to do anything with Yuta's character. This isn't a point of criticism towards Gridman, by the way. Yuta is very deliberately designed to be an outsider and a mechanism to move the story along with. He serves this purpose more than sufficiently, and Gridman really isn't negatively impacted by Yuta's lack of a meaningful character arc. Yomogi just ends up being more interesting because he plays a different role compared to Yuta in their respective animes. The anime continues to hammer on the question as to why the protagonists fight. Well, it mostly hammers this question onto Yomogi. After exploring the destruction in episode 2 and discovering Galma's purpose in episode 3, Yomogi gets an opportunity to be alone and contemplate the question. And he doesn't have an answer to it. I like that he doesn't know the answer to that question at this point, since it's a result of the situation he was put into. It's an intriguing question to pose because it's something that's never asked out of Yuta during all of Gridman, since he rambles on about how it's something that he must do and that only he can do. Yomogi was swept up into the whole Dynazenon ordeal with no warning, and the only reason he's fighting right now is the most obvious one, that kaijus are kinda sorta dangerous. This question isn't something that's expanded on much past this point either, but this time I kinda like that it's never given a clear-cut answer. This is one of those cases where even if we're given an actual answer that goes beyond the kaijus are dangerous motivation, I don't think it would change anything about anyone. I guess it makes Yomogi a little more interesting, but nothing of significance would come out of it. Despite the amazing animation and character interactions within them, the fights in Dynazenon are more like a backdrop to the actual story than anything else. This was very much the case with the back half of Gridman, and it's arguably an even bigger case here with Dynazenon sans the interactions that happen within said fights. So knowing the actual reasons behind why the fights are happening don't contribute much to the main part of the anime. And since we're here and I won't be able to do this at any other point in the video, I'm going to bitch about episode 5 for a little bit. This is easily the worst episode across both Gridman and Dynazenon for a few reasons. The biggest, most glaring issue about it is that the action here is really bad. That's not because it's exceptionally poorly choreographed or animated or anything, because it's not, but it is so obviously trying to fill for time that it's not even attempting to hide it. Transformation and combination animations are a regular part of the action in the series, and I don't mind them one bit because usually they're a one-and-done deal for most fights, and sometimes these are even shortened in order to ensure that the fight itself doesn't lose any tempo. In this episode, the constant use of the transformation and combination animations that gets played over and over adds up to a whopping 127 seconds. That doesn't sound like a lot of time in the grand scheme of things, since most standard animes are about 23 to 24 minutes long, and 127 seconds ends up being just a little longer than 2 minutes or a 12th of the episode's runtime. But after having seen the full combine and the Rex transform animation a couple times in the episodes leading up to this, it gets really grating when the anime plays the entire duration of those animations multiple times throughout the episode. Like I said, these sequences don't typically bother me, but when the anime plays the full combine animation, the Striker Soldier combine animation, the full combine animation again, then the Rex transform animation, it makes things really annoying to watch because it's constantly pausing the fight over and over, which completely kills any excitement surrounding it, especially during my second time through with Dynazenon. And it's a shame too, because I like the kaiju in this episode a lot from a design standpoint. It's a very different design compared to a lot of the stuff seen in both Dynazenon and Gridman, and I thought it was really cool when Dynazenon flips it upside down and it just starts hustling over to attack with its mouth instead of its laser. I like the Striker Combine's design as well, even though the hands are a little goofy, but maybe that's subconsciously the reason why I like it. Given that this is blatantly the fanservice episode, I can't really be mad about it being packed with filler stuff like the full animations and stretching out some scenes like Yume eating her lunch, despite how much I like the context surrounding the latter. The problem isn't something like poor writing or characterization, but rather that nothing of interest happens. Shizumu joining Yomugi and Yume's school is interesting, but nothing comes out of this for a while. The interaction between Koyomi and Inamoto is good, because the anime makes it nice and clear that Koyomi doesn't know how to feel about the situation, especially with some of the mixed signals being thrown his way. But outside of these, not much else is going on. I think it's hilarious that Galma's worst enemy of the series ends up being the lifeguard, and the interaction between Shizumu and Yomugi is okay. You have these individual moments that are fine, but don't really contribute to anything larger within the episode. 5 really sticks out to me like a sore thumb in the entire series as the episode that has the least progression happening in any measurable way. The episodes in the first half of Gridman suffered from a lack of meaningful progression as well, aside from the buildup of tension, but at least there's still, stuff happening in them, even if they might not contribute directly or at all to the main story. Even Gridman's own dedicated fanservice episode had more going on than Dynazenon's episode 5, with Akane directly addressing Yuta, the mission of bringing junk into the mountains, and the fight being an actual fight instead of being constantly interrupted with transformation and combination sequences. It has its own fair share of good interactions too, like the one I mentioned about Yuta and Akane, but also later with Akane and Anti, so yeah, Dynazenon's episode 5, not all that great. Although I should mention that at the end, it's revealed to Yume that her sister Kano was rumored to have committed suicide. Once the news of her sister's rumored suicide has been broken to her alongside some video footage provided by one of Kano's classmates, Yume's behavior shows notable changes. Rather than having some sort of emotional meltdown or a torrential downpour of tears, Yume begins to close herself off and doesn't really interact with other people. The one interaction that the anime makes sure to really hit hard on would be the one between her and Yomugi. She essentially tells Yomugi that what's happening now is none of his business compared to the previous few episodes where she had been clearly opening up to him. This ends up being Yomugi's point of distress for episode 6. The only person she really interacts with during this time is Shizumu, but even that interaction doesn't seem to change a lot. The thing that I like the most about the changes that occur to Yume in this episode is that because of the massive influx of new information about her sister that she comes across, she doesn't really know what to do with this next. She pretty much says that in this episode that the Kano she has been learning about has turned out to be a completely different person than the Kano she knew her whole life. The, let's call it assumptions, of bullying that Fuma, the former vice president of the choir club, informs Yume about has no solid evidence to support it. The video she is provided with works as a way to support it, but it's still nothing that is ultimately conclusive since there's no additional context or information about the video, besides being a supposedly harmless prank. Something the video also does is that it puts one of the previous clubmates Yume talked to in a new light, making her a questionable source of information. And if one source becomes questionable, then suddenly all the others become just as questionable in this context. But once again, these are all rumors, and this conflict is very visibly weighing down upon Yume throughout the episode, as she's seen watching the video several times as if she's trying to uncover some detail that she might have missed during her previous viewing. Speaking of rumors, one detail I never noticed until my second time through is that in episode 1, when Yomugi and his friends are simply talking, they casually mention the existence of a student who took their own life years prior to the events of Dynazenon. This caught me so off guard when I first realized it, and it's honestly a detail that's so easy to overlook. I love this detail as it's a piece of foreshadowing that I'm sure many people besides myself completely forgot about while watching. It's presented in such a passing, insignificant manner. Seriously, this is really cool and genuinely well done. Going back to the story, Fuma thankfully provides some direction for Yume to follow by linking her to Futaba, who was Kano's boyfriend at the time of her death, but this meeting won't be happening for a couple episodes. The anime delivers a lot of details in a really unclear way and refuses to elaborate on it for a while, and it's done really well. I think all of the encounters with Kano's clubmates are fascinating because they all share a collectively hazy memory due to their last interaction, with Kano having been a minimum of 5 years ago. It's also made clear that each person knows different things in different amounts about Kano, which would make sense since they would have all had varying relationships to her, and also acts as a way to justify them constantly sending Yume off from one person to another throughout this chain of hazy memories. You could say that Yume's efforts have finally amounted to something here, but the unsatisfactory nature of the information given here, leaving things in a cloudy state, is a really nice way to add a twist to Yume's story, and I enjoy it a lot. The whole crew spends the night at an observatory, mall, harbor, I don't know what this place is, where they come to terms with the problems that weighed them down in their previous fight, which helped them come together to fight better and stronger the next day. Most of the sequence is in regards to Yomogi and Yume, as Koyomi does a lot of character arcing in 2 scenes separate from this. Yume reveals to Yomogi the reason why she has remained so distant, that being her coming to terms with the fact that the Kano she knew and the Kano others knew were 2 completely different people. They were close when they were both young, but grew apart, and the last time her sister treated her nicely was when she invited Yume to one of her recitals shortly before she died. Yume doesn't know why Kano acted differently shortly before her death, and that's the question that's been lingering on Yume's mind. Although this isn't stated, when combining that brief moment of kindness from Kano with her suicide, the easiest conclusion to reach would be that Kano wanted to do one last act of kindness for her sister before she took her own life. While we know that later Yume does become incredibly upset over this, for now she seems strangely calm about the idea, as if she had come to her own conclusions even if the proper confirmation might not be there. Therefore, the distance she had been putting between herself and others would have been caused by her trying to piece together a meaningful conclusion, and now that she's come to said conclusion, she just needs the confirmation, which would come from Futaba, Kano's boyfriend at the time of her death. In the previous episode, Gauma did warn her that you might not like what you'll learn if you look into it, which ultimately ends up being both very correct and very wrong, and it's a line that I'm ending up really liking in the long run. Between episodes 6 and 7, Yume has taken all of the loose pieces of information and processed them into some sort of conclusion that Kano really was a different person than she originally thought, which has allowed her to open back up to Yomogi about the things she has thought about during that time. This allows both Yomogi and Yume to simultaneously get over the obstacle that has been in their way for the last episode and a half, those being Yume closing herself off and coming to terms with who Kano was while she was alive, respectively. While many of the people that Yume talked to in her story have always been able to provide some amount of information, the meeting with Futaba provides next to nothing. In fact, the only thing Futaba really says here is that he feels very confident that Kano did not commit suicide. And while everyone generally was able to point Yume towards another direction, towards another individual that might know more, Futaba leaves without providing any direction. While the things Futaba says offers the least amount of new information, as a matter of fact he doesn't have any new information to give, this is what draws out the greatest emotional reaction from Yume, far above any of her previous meetings with Kano's clubmates, even the rumor of suicide. The abrupt stop that this meeting with Futaba places on Yume's efforts to draw a clear image of everything leading up to Kano's death provides no closure, because the whole point of it is to provide no closure. All the evidence given so far points to the conclusion that Kano committed suicide as a result of bullying, yet the person that would have known her the best during the final stretch of her life quickly and with little emotion claims that Kano wouldn't have done that. This isn't the answer Yume wanted to hear, since she had convinced herself that Kano had committed suicide by this point in the story, built upon that mountain of other people's stories and perspectives. It's the realization that this is all she's going to get and that there are no more leads after Futaba that triggers the reaction that comes out of Yume. Retrospectively speaking, we know that this isn't the end of the story, because episode 10 gives us the definitive conclusion. When I first watched Dynazenon, I wasn't a huge fan of how little closure the story provided here because I wanted something more conclusive to stand by. It's definitely another one of the reasons why my overall opinion of Dynazenon was on the iffy side during my first time watching it, but given the overarching theme of the lack of closure, I think this is a really good scene due to its ability to throw Yume's entire story into turmoil while adding very little to it. It also makes the following episode more impactful because it proves that one side of the story in the most convincing manner possible is correct. Even though it's been on the slower side when compared to Yume, Koyomi's character gets some well-earned development in episode 6. When Inamoto invites her husband to join them while she's out for drinks with Koyomi, he understandably becomes upset, given that he clearly still has feelings for her and she also talked about feeling uncertain about marriage during the previous outing. You could even combine this with some of her dialogue from episode 4 to say that Inamoto doesn't really know what she wants in life, both in the past and in the present. While noticeably intoxicated, Koyomi encounters Mujina in front of this very cleverly disguised 7-Eleven, where he eventually loses Dyna Striker because it slips out of his pocket, with Mujina scooping it up then piecing out. Koyomi, half supported by and half intimidated by Gauma, locates and breaks into the warehouse that the eugenicists were using as a temporary hideout. I'll be the first one to admit that Mujina was one of, if not the last character, in the entire anime that I expected to have parallels drawn alongside Koyomi, but the anime does it well here. The parallels are characterized by both Koyomi and Mujina not having any goals in their life that they actively pursue or any direction to follow. This is really easy to observe with Koyomi since he's undeniably a NEET, and there's plenty of footage throughout the anime to support this. Mujina hasn't really been a noteworthy character up until this point. Shizuma has gone out of his way to join the school and tag along with the rest of the protagonists to the water park. Onija gets really pissed off all the time and keeps finding ways to get crushed by flying kaiju parts. Even Chuga has taken some time out of his day to go have a one-on-one talk with Yomugi. But Mujina hasn't really done anything up until now besides control one kaiju, so it's difficult to pinpoint anything prior to 6 that supports the idea of her lacking a goal to pursue or a direction to follow. In this episode, the eugenicists attempt to make 2 different decisions and fail to come to a consensus both times. The first decision comes in the form of a question posed by Chuga, who asks whether or not they should kill the Dynazenon crew. Onija very emphatically says yes, whereas Shizuma says no. The second decision that needs to be made is in regards to the stolen striker. Onija says that they should use it themselves, Chuga wants to use it to negotiate, and Shizuma wants to give it back. For both decisions, Mujina remains undecided and wants everyone else to make the choice. The other eugenicists seem to know what they want to do with their new chance at life, at least in the context of dealing with Dynazenon and the kaijus, which is seen through the various ways in which they want to respond to the situations at hand. Mujina clearly doesn't seem to have an opinion that leans toward either end of the spectrum, and this is indicative of her not knowing what she wants to do with her new chance at life. Now, Mujina already sees a change of heart in this episode when Shizuma tells her something along the lines of how kaiju must change for the world to change and we must change too. Whatever this means, this ends up providing just the right motivation for Mujina to experience a shift in perspective as seen by her freshly aggressive attitude during episode 6's fight. Koyomi's change in this episode isn't as significant, but that's to be expected given that his character arc is spread across a larger number of episodes compared to Mujina's. In essence, the one thing that has haunted Koyomi for a long time is an encounter that happened with Inamoto in the past. All that needs to be said about it now is that Koyomi ran away from that event, and given his worried comment about how Yume is facing her own problems without running away, it's safe to conclude that Koyomi's main issue is his tendency to run away and not face his problems. Him breaking open the window and charging into the warehouse to retrieve Dyna Striker is clearly the first attempt at fixing this problem of his thanks to Gauma putting all of the responsibility onto him. If we were to connect the 2 points about Koyomi made in this episode, you could say that his tendency to run away from his problems is the reason why he doesn't have a goal in life, since he never intends on solving his problems. So there's the parallels drawn between Mujina and Koyomi. There's a little more to these two besides this, but we'll touch upon that when the time is slightly more appropriate. Like I said, it's not one I expected, and it ended up being more extensive than I initially imagined, but I think it's a good way to both progress these characters' respective arcs as well as introduce a new and unexpected dynamic. Coming fresh off of 6, Koyomi's character arc continues in 7 with 2 scenes. The first scene is the one that I find the most interesting since him aiding in the rescue of Inamoto's husband is alright, he's just being a decent human being. The definitively more notable part of this scene is when Koyomi approaches Inamoto's husband, thinks for a second to himself about some of his resentful feelings towards him, and actually walks away for a few seconds. Despite how short that scene is, it's made many times more interesting by the fact that Koyomi never really elaborates on this at all, aside from later on in the episode when he confesses to Gauma that he rescued someone that he thinks he hates. I think it says a lot about how Koyomi feels about his current situation in regards to Inamoto when he both chooses to walk away and also to return to help. You could say that maybe he realized that his resentment towards Inamoto's husband causing him to walk away could have resulted in a loss of life, and his return signifies him getting over that resentment in order to do the right and proper thing. If he walked away and never looked back here, he'd be running away from another one of his problems. The second scene later on in the episode, when he hangs up on Inamoto, basically confirms that he's gotten over his leftover feelings for her since there isn't much deliberation or hesitation when he abruptly ends the call. He doesn't say a final goodbye or even stumbles over his words, he just cuts the call while Inamoto is in the middle of speaking. It's the simple decisiveness with which he acts here that speaks volumes, since it indicates that he's already made up his mind back when he helped to rescue Inamoto's husband. So I really like the fight in episode 6 for a number of reasons. Firstly, it immediately resolved the main issue I had with the fight in the previous episode in regards to the combine and transform animations. In this episode, they play an abridged version of the full combine animation, while the transform animation was entirely cut with the exception of the very last bit where Dynarex does his little pose. Something else that's also really cool about this episode's fight is that the anime spared no expenses when it came to making this kaiju as obnoxiously powerful as possible. It has insane gravitational powers that can punch out craters in the middle of the city in a matter of seconds, all while being able to create giant chain explosions. It's also one of the total 2 kaijus throughout all of Dynazenon that require multiple people to control it, this one specifically requiring 2. Everyone minus Gamma is upset and or distracted for individually different reasons, hence why the power output of Dynazenon is below the usual standards in this episode, which makes the disparity between it and the kaiju even larger. After the dampened quality of the previous episode's fight due to the consistent and lengthy interruptions, I think the fight in this episode is a really nice and refreshing way to increase the quality of the action and in multiple ways as well. It should go without saying that when Grid Knight jumped out of the sky at the end of episode 6, I immediately transformed into that picture of Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the screen. While I'd say the first half of Dynazenon can be very comfortably viewed by someone that didn't watch Gridman without missing a single beat, the reintroduction of Anti, now named Knight, and the second back into the series, fundamentally requires knowledge of Gridman for it to make sense, and for some of the scenes involving those two to have further weight to them. By this point, I had completely convinced myself that Dynazenon and Gridman were 2 entirely separate stories that just happened to take place within the same universe. While these are still 2 separate stories, in terms of the content of those stories and how they're told, the 2 animes ended up being more connected than I initially expected going into Dynazenon. I know that sounds silly because, well, these are 2 animes that belong to the same series, but Gridman's ending was so conclusive and the story was closed off in such a strong way that I didn't expect any of it to make it across to Dynazenon outside of a few cheeky references. That's still there with how Dynazenon is very clearly a physical reflection of the same world we saw in Gridman, given how the anime deliberately shows off shots of the same locations from the same angles present in Gridman. An example of this that I think is really cool is in episode 8, where we get to see what is this world's equivalent of Rika's shop. Back in Gridman's world, Akuna's house was immediately adjacent to the shop, but in Dynazenon's world, it's replaced by what looks like part of an apartment building. Maybe it's because Akuna never existed in this world, so she never had a place to stay, or since she removed herself from her own world, all of the parallel ones mirrored that to replace her house with something that fits the world more naturally. Or maybe the artists just drew the apartments in to fill that side of the screen and I'm just digging for details where there aren't any. The connection between the 2 made by Grid Knight's appearance at first felt really forced and sort of jammed into the story for the sake of it, but as things go on, Knight and the second integrate really nicely into Dynazenon, so I have nothing but nice things to say about this addition. Yomogi is shown in 2 separate cases to be able to use instance domination in episode 8, albeit to a rather weak degree. Just as an FYI, the instance domination ability is what the eugenicists use to take control of the kaijus. In the first instance, the kaiju very lightly reacts to it. The second instance of it is more notable, where the kaiju pauses for a second, turning its head around to reveal its eye and stare directly at Yomogi. I'll admit that it's difficult to tell whether or not the reveal of the eye was caused by the instance domination due to the short delay between those 2 things happening, but it is still a thing that happens. I really like the way that it's introduced in this episode, since it begins with everyone else trying to control the baby kaiju as a way to make fun of Galma's inability to do so. Yomogi's the last one to do so, and he kind of does it out of obligation, and instead of it impacting the kaiju, it instead comes back to affect Yomogi by showing him a brief glimpse of what I assume is the core of the baby kaiju. Yomogi doesn't tell anyone about what happened, nor does the anime really touch on this at all until the very end of the episode. It seems like such a harmless scene at first that ends up being nothing but a wholesome bit of character interaction until the anime decides that it's not for a second before it goes back like nothing ever happened. I don't really have a whole lot to say about the second case of Yomogi's instance domination, but what I do have something to say about is that after this episode, this isn't mentioned again until the very, very end. And when I say it isn't mentioned, I mean it's never brought up in even the smallest capacity. And I think this is such a shame. Up until this point, Yomogi certainly isn't a bad character. He's pretty alright and far more interesting than Yuta ever was, as I've said before. However, when compared to the characters he hangs out with, namely Yume and Koyomi, he doesn't have a whole lot going on for him. His family situation, while briefly touched on in episodes 1 and 6, is never explored in a meaningful way, and while his developing feelings for Yume is good and gives him a sense of character progression, this is nowhere near as complex or as interesting as some of the stuff that Yume and Koyomi are going through. I think this could have been a great way to put Yomogi on par with him possibly experimenting and developing upon his newly realized powers as Yomogi tries to come to terms with whether or not he should use this power, let alone tell others about it. This could have been a way to give Yomogi a standalone storyline to work with rather than him having to hold hands with Yume's story for most of the anime. This lack of a standalone story for Yomogi might seem like a weird point to keep hammering down on, since I didn't want the same things for Yuta, who only sort of has a standalone story to lean upon in the first half of Gridman before essentially turning into a background character in the latter half. The difference here is that Yomogi is meant to be a much more substantial character than Yuta is. Dynazenon already gives him more attention and progression to his character than Gridman ever did with Yuta. So I don't think I'm unjustified here to say that there should be something more to come with Yomogi's character than Yuta's, because the anime sets him up in that manner, just like how Gridman set up Yuta to be a delivery boy for the story. The final episode kind of has this idea with how he decides to use Instance Domination as a very last resort move, but I've already explained how the anime doesn't expand upon Yomogi's abilities at all before pulling this move out, so it feels like a rushed ending place to patch up a hole in the character. Again, it's really hard to look at Dynazenon and demand more out of it because there's already so much stuff going on, but I can't help but do some wishful thinking. Episode 8 brings up the discussion about the morality and ethics behind killing kaijus, if you want to call it that. Kaijus are born out of human emotions, so Yomogi ponders whether or not kaijus could have hearts. Knight confirms that some kaijus do have hearts, but that it's never worth gambling on whether or not a kaiju has one because a wrong guess could result in a loss of life. It's also fascinating that this question is posed in an episode that features the least destructive kaiju of the entire series. It's not necessarily harmless since the size it eventually develops to, but its power of causing random gradient patches of color to appear is pathetic, all things considered. Even the way that it plays with Dyna Striker sets it apart from all of the other kaijus, since this one seems like it's playing with a new toy rather than trying to kill Koyomi or maximize its potential destruction. The thing to note here is that the anime has shown definitive proof that the eugenicists aren't controlling the kaiju this time around, since they're off on holiday and trying stuff out while waiting for other more destructive kaijus to appear. Shizumu literally walks past this thing and just ignores it because he thinks it's pathetic too. Given the lack of destructive desire and the eugenicists being out of the picture, I think the anime does a good job at asking the question of whether or not kaijus were innocent creatures the entire time with their own hearts and feelings. Some of the other kaijus, when left untouched, merely clinging to bridges or getting stuck in underpasses, further supports that idea as well. Knight's perspective of killing every kaiju despite their hearts and feelings is a justified one, however, since all we need to look at is SSSS.Gridman, where Anti witnessed all of Akane's other creations wreaking havoc over and over and in increasingly destructive ways, and he himself took part in both destroying a city and slaying all of those kaijus near the end when he made his transition into Grid Knight. I think the idea as a whole is a great one that unfortunately doesn't get to see much more development upon, but this time around I'm okay with it. This is one of those questions where I enjoy an open-ended answer, where each viewer can take the stance they want on the matter. I myself lean towards Knight's more brutal but pragmatic outlook, since the events of Gridman did a lot of work in displaying the dangers that kaijus pose to a world. Chise and Goldburn make for a really interesting aspect of Dynazenon's story to inspect. On one hand, I think the idea of giving the characters a kaiju they could directly interact with, and one that did prove to be different from many of the other kaijus, is great. On the other hand, I think that Goldburn should have been introduced a lot earlier in the anime to give Chise something to put her on par with everyone else. The little kaiju core she picked up way back at the start of the anime really took its sweet time to grow, yet Goldburn goes from very little to quite big in a rather short span of time. The entire episode seemingly takes place within a single day, so the comparison between Goldburn and the core is not even close. Before Goldburn entered the picture, Chise was a noticeably less significant character compared to everyone else. Koyomi and Yume had their own individual story arcs that the anime carefully built upon. Yomogi was always around during many of the developments in Yume's story arc, and Gauma is Gauma. His personality and the way he sticks out in comparison to every other character always made him entertaining to watch. But Chise had very little going on for her outside of being Koyomi's sidekick. Episode 7 is the only other episode outside of 9 where I'd say the anime put some effort into highlighting Chise. In this case, it's highlighting her as an outlier, whether that's through having her be the only one that isn't told where to meet because she almost certainly slipped out of Gauma's mind since she doesn't properly pilot any of the Dynazenon pieces, or her seen wandering around alone while Yume and Yomogi are paired together as Gauma and Koyomi paired together off to the side. It ends up being some decent setup, but is ultimately still far below the amount of work put into the other 4 characters by that point. The reason why I feel so strongly about wanting to bring Goldburn into the story earlier is because what the anime presents in episode 9 in regards to Chise is very good, and I wish it got to be seen over a longer period of time rather than being confined to just this episode. The emotion that Goldburn's core had been feeding off of was the feeling of Chise not belonging with the rest of the group. Everyone else had a part of Dynazenon they were responsible for piloting, and while Chise did get the opportunity to pilot Dynasoldier once, that ended up being a complete disaster. So I wish the anime brought that aspect of her character up far earlier like it did a bit in 7, and also have Goldburn hatch, for a lack of better words, earlier as well. And we don't need to rewrite or add in completely new things to make this work either, since episode 9 has everything we need. There is a very solid foundation for Chisa and Goldburn, with the attempts of Chisa trying to hide Goldburn, as well as her trying to figure out where a kaiju that can communicate with people fits into within their world. Take the few scenes in episode 9 that reflect these concepts and sprinkle them throughout the first 8 episodes, and Chisa now becomes a much more interesting character over a longer period of time instead of becoming a sudden focal point for a single episode then fading back out. Episode 9 can still be that climax where Goldburn is revealed to everyone else and they do the big fancy fusion dance, but there's a much more substantial build-up for a longer period of time leading up to it. Dynazenon is very much about telling its stories through a slow and steady burn, and I think restructuring Chisa's entire story arc into a more expanded format would have fit nicely into that mold as well. And now that I've mentioned the big fancy fusion dance, it only seems appropriate to mention some of the more fighting ridiculousness that happens to our sweet summer boy Dynazenon. Episode 7's fight gets wacky, what with the whole writing thing, or how he picks up Gridnight by the arm and lets it rip by catapulting him into the kaiju's neck. It gets even weirder with Dynasoldier straight up transforming into a gun in episode 8, but none of this even stands a chance against episode 9. Super Dragon King Kaiser Starlight Rare Dynamax Limit Broken Gridnight is about as ridiculous as things get, and I think it's the peak example of that kind of one-upmanship that I talked about that's present throughout the way Dynazenon's action is designed. I don't really get why the episode 9 kaiju of all things is what prompts the Super Mega Fusion, but it's not really that important in the grand scheme of things. Contrary to some of my complaints about the length of combination and transformation animations in episode 5, I really like that they go as far out of their way as possible to make this transformation sequence as lengthy as it can be due to the sheer ridiculousness of it, including the new music introduced for this sequence that is way different compared to the music typically used during these moments in fights. So we've covered pretty much everything up to episode 9 now. Almost every character arc has been fully built up, and all that really remains is to receive the conclusions in episode 10, then to witness the aftermath in episodes 11 and 12. But before we do that, there's just one last thing that we need to touch upon. Some of you guys might have been wondering since the prologue for Dynazenon as to when I was finally going to bring it up, and this is going to be that moment. Back in that prologue, I mentioned that there is one specific thing that Dynazenon does significantly worse than in Gridman. It's finally time to pull back the curtain and find out what this is. So far, the progression in this part of the video has been mostly linear. By that I mean that the order in which we've covered stuff has been in the order of the episodes. We've had to jump around here and there to cover specific stories in a slightly more straightforward manner, but still mostly linear. Now we're going to do that all over again and jump almost all the way back to the start of Dynazenon to look at a group of characters we've mentioned but haven't really talked about in detail yet, the kaiju eugenicists. The fundamental issue that I have with this group, and the single thing that Dynazenon does far worse than Gridman, is that while I think they are good characters, they make for poor villains. This is pretty much the main reason why I prefer Gridman over Dynazenon, because Akane is an absolutely incredible villain, with the story taking plenty of creative liberties to make sure the viewer gets a complete understanding of her side of the story and why she does everything that she does. The eugenicists are severely lacking in this department. The more human and, I'll call it the emotional side of these characters, is done well. All 4 of the eugenicists have clearly distinct personalities and perspectives that shine through when they interact both within themselves and with other outside characters. The anime does take a couple steps in trying to tell the story from their side and to display their motivations, but it's nearly impossible to understand for us non-kaiju wielding plebeians. Episodes 2 and 3 are mostly the introductions to the eugenicists. Episode 2 is just the introduction, as in they only appear in the end and don't do anything else. Episode 3 has a little bit more going on, but again, nothing of real significance comes out of it. It's not until episode 4 where the anime finally gives us something to dig into with them. We get some more insight into the kaiju eugenicists here, although calling this insight as helpful might be a bit of a stretch. There's a lot of philosophical nonsense coming from Shizumu during this episode about how the eugenicists want to create a world where kaiju are needed and that kaijus are what free people from being bound by something, and Juga mentions later in the episode that Shizumu can hear the voices of kaijus. These are all genuinely interesting ideas on paper, and I really mean it when I say it, but within the bubble of the first 4 episodes, none of this really makes sense and there's no evidence to support these ideas, nor does the anime seem to provide any clear direction as to how these ideas might be expanded upon. But that's all fine, it's still early, and given how bizarre and nebulous these concepts all seem at first, the anime clearly must have some kind of idea on how to expand upon these. However, by the end, I don't think any of these ideas are built upon successfully, if at all. The easiest one to cross off the list would be the one about Shizuma hearing the voices of kaijus. There's nothing throughout the anime that supports or expands upon it in a meaningful way. I'm sure it does happen, but nothing comes of it. The eugenicists wanting to create a world where kaiju are needed is a very difficult point to understand as well, since all the eugenicists do with the kaijus are take over them and then start stomping around and trashing cities. The concept of a world in which humans need kaijus in order to function as a society or even barely exist is the most fascinating of the three ideas to me, and it's the one that disappoints me the most. There's some very vague hints of it in episode 10, but it's incredibly difficult to tell as to what purpose those kaijus might serve in that world, aside from being a really badass way of getting around town. The idea that I have the most mixed feelings on is that people are bound by something and that kaijus free them. We get exactly one example of this through the entire anime, Goldburn. Goldburn is an example of this since it helps free Chise from all the negativity she secretly amassed while also finally being able to contribute to the fights and actually be a part of the team. It's very helpful that this is a clear example rather than being something buried under a semantic landfill of minute details and references. Outside of Goldburn, there is no other example of a kaiju freeing someone from their bindings, since while all of the other kaijus might be created by human emotions, we don't know what emotions caused these kaijus to form in the first place, so there's no way for us to substantiate the idea. Even though Goldburn is a good example, it stands as the only example, which is why I feel so mixed about the whole freed by kaijus thing. And this is all such a big shame too, since, like I said, I think the eugenicists are all interesting characters. There's some internal dynamics that are fun to watch between characters like Mujina and Onija, and I love the fact that they're just going through town doing completely normal things whenever there isn't any instance dominating to do, all while nobody seems to notice nor care about their ridiculous outfits. There's even more of this kind of characterization that comes out of them later on as well, and honestly, Shizuma really does end up being the least interesting of the four eugenicists because of how aloof he can be alongside his mysteriously philosophical statements. It really does end up being important to emphasize that while the eugenicists are good characters, they aren't good villains. In episode 5, Shizuma spouts some more philosophical nonsense when he goes to the shallow pot pool thing with Yume and Yomogi. It was around this time during my second viewing when an idea finally struck me. I don't think any of this philosophical stuff is supposed to make sense, or at least make sense in a coherent way to the viewer, without needing to read between the lines or be well versed with references. I'm sure there is something to it all if you really pick at the details, or maybe these lines really are just a reference to something else entirely that I'm not privy to. In any case, the impression that I've been getting is that Shizuma has been specifically written in the way that he is in order to distance him away from other characters in a very unique manner, all for the eventual setup towards the end. He's meant to feel like a character that resides above everyone else, to provide a more extreme contrast to Yomogi, who is meant to be a very humanized character with the most clear-cut interaction between the two of them being the final one in episode 2. If this is meant to be the case with Shizuma, then I think it's okay. If this really is the case, then I still don't think it turns the eugenicists into better villains solely because of this reason. Episode 6 has some development around Mujina, but we've already discussed this during the previous chapter when talking about Koyomi, so we'll move on, which takes us into episode 8. One thing that's nice about this episode is the emphasis on returning to a more loose, casual outlook onto the eugenicists. It's been a little while since we got to see the group as a whole interacting together outside of fights since episode 5, and what's shown in 8 is basically a nicely expanded version of what was in 5. It's not a particularly consequential thing, but it's nice to see the human side of these characters pop up more often than not. Episode 9 contains Juga's line of "there's not an infinite number of kaijus, you know," which hits surprisingly hard, and it really came out of nowhere. This line during my second viewing single-handedly changed some of my perspectives on the eugenicists, which makes me wish that these characters had their villain sides written better. I said it before, and I really need to emphasize it again, and I'm probably gonna do it again afterwards. The kaiju eugenicists are good characters, but poor villains. They always kind of popped out during the back half of most episodes and sort of broke the flow of the story by dropping a kaiju into the thick of things. Their motivations were always vague or seemingly non-existent, with Shizuma providing the smallest inkling about how they want to make a world that needs kaijus, but they try to do this by wrecking cities and killing innocent people in the process. Yes, Akane did the exact same thing, but she had a very clear, observable motive that Gridman made sure to emphasize in the early episodes, all while her motivations and actions aligned very closely through the entirety of the anime. There might be some connection between the motivations and actions of the eugenicists that could be drawn that I'm too stupid to see or something, but as far as I can tell, these two things are very disconnected from one another. It's very difficult to see how these attacks are meant to progress things for the eugenicists aside from maybe, just maybe, these fights generating some amount of emotion for Shizuma to observe. The only other guess that I would have is that they're trying to destroy as much as possible in order to rebuild the world from the ground up, but if it really was meant to be as extreme as this, I think it should have been more explicitly expressed. I want to clarify that I don't think every good villain needs to have an understandable or relatable motive. I just ask that their actions reflect their goals, and when it doesn't, for the story to provide a reason or clue towards this deviation. I'm more than happy with occasionally accepting explanations that aren't crystal clear or a little bit of weirdness that needs to be there for the story to work. Stories and characters don't need watertight writing to be enjoyable, and sometimes trying to write out a proper and sensible explanation or motivation for everything can lead to things being weighed down and overcomplicated by ultimately inconsequential details. However, excluding the first episode, the eugenicists appear in every single episode. A solid amount of time is devoted to these characters and they play relevant roles by being responsible for controlling most of the kaijus in Dynazenon. So while I would be fine with that disconnect in their character if they weren't very important characters, the anime repeatedly puts attention onto them, so it's not something I can comfortably ignore. The eugenicists don't have an understandable or relatable motive, nor do their actions seem connected to their motive without requiring me to stretch my imagination to fit an explanation around the motive. Anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that I have a very hard time caring about the villain side of the eugenicists. So that line out of Juga in regards to the finite number of kaijus came out of left field for me because it finally put into a more clear frame where the villain side of the eugenicists were standing at during that point of the story. This isn't something the anime ever really touched upon until now, but it's something that I think it does really well going into episodes 10 and 11. Mind you, this doesn't bridge the gap between their motivation and action. That still very much exists even after all of this framing. It's just that Chuga's defeated tone and Shizuma's agreement on his statement finally provides some insight into how they may be feeling about their motivations that isn't more philosophical nonsense out of Shizuma. Akane's gradual loss of confidence and increasing desperation in Gridman made her a great character to observe from start to finish because of her steady change eventually amounting to the climaxes that are episodes 9 and 10. The eugenicists don't have this kind of steady change to their character arcs, nor does it ever really amount to anything significant. I don't mind this deflated kind of ending to their main story. In fact, I like it a lot because of it finally linking together the character side and the villain side of the group and being able to provide a sympathetic lens to view them through. I just wish the decline leading into this deflated ending was more noticeable and gradual. The last thing I have to say about the eugenicists is in regards to Bujina, which requires us to jump ahead a few episodes. In episode 11, Bujina approaches Koyomi. She asks him if he hates her, to which he says no since she was doing her job. She replies to this by saying that she despises him. So what the fuck is up with that? What did our boy do so wrong here that he deserves this hate? I have two ways of looking at this. Earlier, I said that these two characters were united through a lack of direction and goals in their lives. By episode 11, Koyomi is attempting to get his life back together and follow some direction even if it isn't the most impressive one. On the contrary, Bujina has more or less lost the single purpose in her life, her ability to control kaijus. This loss becomes even more significant when you remember that in episodes 6 and 7, you could clearly tell that there was this sort of fire that was rekindled inside Bujina in regards to controlling kaijus, as if she was able to get some sort of direction back. So the only person she could relate to now has chosen to move on with their lives while she can't, so this could be interpreted as jealousy or even some kind of resentment for being left behind. The second way of looking at this would be that she blames the loss of her single purpose directly onto Koyomi since he's the only member of the Dynazenon squad that she has directly interacted with. This manifests a little more later on in the final episode through some additional aggression on Bujina's behalf. Even though this is going to be a bit of an unimpressive way to finish this chapter, let's talk about whether or not this chapter matters at all. Is having the eugenicists be good villains important for Dynazenon's story to be delivered well? In Gridman's case, this is an emphatic yes, because the entire story becomes about its villain, so that character better be good or at the very least have something interesting going on for them. But let's imagine this scenario for Dynazenon. The eugenicists still exist, but they no longer have the power to control kaijus. However, the kaijus now do all of the rampaging and destroying on their own will. Let's change nothing else about the anime besides that and pretend that any of the missing minutes are filled in with some more fight scenes. The eugenicists still get to have their neat character moments, but are no longer classifiable as villains. Does this proposed change have a significant enough impact on Dynazenon's main story? I don't think so. It felt weird for me to write it, and it still feels weird for me to say it, but the fights in Dynazenon were always about a kaiju appearing, not about the eugenicists. In episode 8, when the gradient color kaiju got out of hand but wasn't destroying anything intentionally, they still went out of their way to handle it. I have to imagine that every other kaiju, even without the eugenicists' influence, would have been handled the same way. As a matter of fact, once almost every kaiju disappears after episode 10, the protagonists seem to completely forget about the eugenicists. The group doesn't even seem to be on the radar for the protagonists with the exceptions of when Juga and Shizuma directly confront them. You could even say that the actual villains of Dynazenon were never these guys, and that it was instead the eventual reality of the stories that characters like Koyomi and Yume were chasing. So if these villains aren't ultimately too important to the overall story, then does it even matter if some parts of them aren't great? This is something that I don't have an answer to, and I don't know if it's a question that I'll ever have an answer to. All that's left for us are the final 3 episodes. As I've said before, episode 10 gives us the conclusion to a lot of these stories, while episodes 11 and 12 are the aftermath. Let's not wait around much longer and begin looking at the final arcs of Dynazenon. As is the case with the series-defining episodes, such as Gridman's 9 and 10, the powers of the kaijus within those episodes are always important to look at, and it is no different here with episode 10 of SSSS.Dynazenon. Our boy here is very similar to his monstrous cousin back in Gridman's episode 9, but if everything about that kaiju was cranked up to the max. This kaiju indiscriminately consumes every single person within the city into the prison of memories inside itself. It simply deletes people and buildings and everything, leaving virtually nothing behind besides their shadows. I think the vast empty landscape that the fight of this episode takes place in does a really good job at displaying that sheer scale of this kaiju's abilities, even if that landscape sits far behind the actual fighting itself. While this kaiju is the most powerful in the entire series when purely looking at the sheer area that it has impacted, it's offset by the fact that it has one of the least destructive abilities in the sense that all the people and the buildings it consumes end up coming back out untouched. The distorted interior of random pipes and CRT screens heavily reminds me of Gridman's episode 9 as well. The fact that the kaiju cuts and pastes people out of the city and into itself with the anime putting in what is actually the bare minimum effort for this transition really adds to the overwhelmingly surreal feel of the episode. This sort of surreal feeling hits a peak for me when Yomogi is the only person remaining to not be consumed by the kaiju, and the kaiju proceeds to stare down Yomogi as it opens its mouth. Yomogi jumps straight into the maw of the beast as if there was some sort of innate connection between the two about what had to be done. That being said, even though this kaiju's capabilities are greater than its cousin in Gridman, I personally find it less interesting than that one because we don't know who created it nor the reason behind its creation. Why this kaiju is specifically so much more potent compared to the rest remains as an unsolved mystery. This is all fine and dandy and kind of loops back into the lack of closure, but I think that it just makes this kaiju less interesting than the one in Gridman's 9, since this lack of motivation from it means that there isn't anything to dig into in that regards, and that was by far the most memorable part about the kaiju of Gridman's 9. Yume's memory here is the most simple one to look at because Yume is basically reliving the entire events of the past but from her present perspective. As seen by Koyomi's memories, those captured in these memories have the ability to alter the events that happen for a slightly different outcome even if these slightly different outcomes don't change anything in the real world. And Yume does that at the very end of her own memory too when she runs after Kano after hearing that she would head to the floodgate, the site of her eventual death. As the extremely distressed Yume calls out to Kano to stop, Kano merely confirms that she never committed suicide. This final piece of confirmation out of Kano is done in a way that doesn't dramatize or overemphasize it. It's almost anticlimactic with how matter-of-fact Kano's tone of voice is, and I really think that this is for the best. It sets a nice contrast to the first rumors of her suicide at the end of episode 5, which was cut off before the word suicide could even be completed, which should explain the earlier abrupt ending to one of the chapters. Furthermore, it also shows that the person that knew Kano the best during her last living moments, Futaba, was ultimately correct, despite how upset it made Yume due to the lack of conclusive answers she was given. Despite all of the investigating, tracing, and theorizing that Yume had put both herself and the viewers through in order to craft a conclusive case for closure, the final correct answer turned out to be the one she knew from the very start. As Yume sits down and talks to Kano, making amends over how the two of them drifted apart from one another, Yume finally manages to solve and separate the linked onks she had been fiddling with the entire anime, and as she does, the memory freezes and cracks, opening an exit for her. This is obviously some heavy-handed symbolism about Yume finally getting closure over the death of her sister, and much like how the two onks let go of each other, she's ready to let Kano go. There is no overwhelming revelation or minuscule details to sink your teeth into. What started as a thing of curiosity to learn more about her sister led to Yume tracing the steps of Kano's past to find the details of her death and those supposedly responsible for it, and while some details were unearthed, none of it ultimately mattered and none of these details were ever conclusive to begin with. You could even say that this entire venture was pointless because what Yume knew from the very start turned out to be correct the entire time. Even if she was able to confirm without a shadow of a doubt that Kano committed suicide, it would change nothing because Kano is still dead. That's why Yume's reaction to finding Kano atop the floodgate is as emotional as it is, despite the ordinary nature of Kano's answer, since the realization that nothing will change has finally hit her after having chased the truth for so long. I think the anime did a wonderful job in taking the viewer along the same ride as well, by very slowly revealing questionable details and piecing together a bigger picture through what initially seems like a bit of curiosity before it turns into an obsession for Yume. It creates a sense of anticipation that it would eventually all amount to some sort of grand reveal, only to metaphorically and literally shatter it by bringing up the futility of it to the forefront. This memory sequence is by far the most clear-cut example of that lack of closure through loose ends, incomplete answers, and unsatisfactory endings, and I think the anime is all the better for it. Koyomi's memory is the most interesting in the sense that it takes the question of what if that's been haunting him for many episodes and finally answers it. What if he did run away with Inamoto and that sack of money she found? Unfortunately, the anime doesn't provide the most enthralling of answers here, since all we really see as an answer to that question would be that the two of them bought a motorcycle together and then drove to the beach. I'm going to quickly put on my symbolistic analysis cap here and say that this is supposed to represent some sort of unrestricted freedom, what with the speed of the bike and the openness of the beach, in contrast to Koyomi's small and catastrophically messy room and his directionless lifestyle. Koyomi does get his own bit of closure here with the money flying away and Inamoto directly addressing him about how none of this is real. It's key to note that when the money begins flying away, Koyomi instinctively begins running after it, trying to grasp onto the last few bills that he can. This, in conjunction with the content look on his face before Yomogi breaks in, speaks to me that the fantasy of his what if brings him some amount of comfort that his current life was missing. Inamoto's life was about the momentary and false nature of this memory seems to cause Koyomi to snap back to reality, and that no matter how much he might want to answer that question looming over his head, some questions will simply never be answered, and the answer won't change his life either. The biggest piece of evidence to support that realization doesn't come from this episode, but rather the one following this one, where Koyomi finally begins taking steps at moving his life away from the standstill point that it remained at for so long, even if those steps aren't necessarily successful. And although this isn't related to the deeper meaning behind memory in any way, I really like the visuals of Koyomi's memory. There isn't, or at least I don't think there is, any fancy effects or animations used to try and characterize the scenes in any way. The drained color palette and the choppy animation works wonders for this sequence, both in making it stand out from everything else, but also to highlight the fleeting and imaginary nature of this memory. There's just a few more little things about episode 10 I'd like to touch upon. After all the things I had to say about Yume and Koyomi's memories, I have very little to say in regards to Galma's memory. I think it's cool to see a bit of backstory between him and the eugenicists and why he and them split apart, but that's really all that I have. Maybe there's some references there, but as I've said before, those are outside of my realm of understanding. Outside of those memories though, it should be noted that this episode is the first time in which Galma's physical decline is highlighted, which becomes more important in the final two episodes. I don't know what to say about the anime briefly flickering back onto Galma's dying body from the memory during the last seconds of the episode. I doubt it's a reference to anything, nor is it meant to symbolize something. Maybe it's meant to emphasize Galma's physical decline to the viewer and for them to keep a lookout for it in the following episodes. The general weirdness of the episode can't be understated in any way, but it's also something that's not really worth any time discussing as far as I'm concerned. Sure, you could ask the questions, like why Yomogi is able to walk around inside the kaiju no problem, or why he's the only one able to break in and out the walls of each memories, or how he finds everyone's respective memories if this kaiju supposedly swallowed the entire city, or how Dino Wing manages to manifest pieces of itself into Yume's memory, or why this specific kaiju couldn't be controlled by the eugenicists, and etc, etc. But another question you could ask in response to those questions is, what about the story changes if you know those answers? And the answer to that question is basically nothing. Yeah, a lot of it is weird, but it's weirdness that helps keep the episode moving along, and it's really the only way that the unique structure, flow, and atmosphere of the episode can be maintained. This weirdness doesn't even feel all that out of place for the anime either, since episode 10 starts off immediately, with no opening and people disappearing one after another with no warning, visual reaction, or even sound from them. Even the style of animation in episode 10, which is notably different compared to every other episode, contributes to this as well, with the generally rougher look of everyone and everything outside of the kaiju alongside the blurry and hazy look of the memories. I especially love the CRT effect that pops up within the kaiju, since I think it adds a lot visually to that sense of weirdness, and is also a bit of strange nostalgia for me since we had a CRT TV back when I was really little. I can't say whether or not this visual difference was completely intentional or if it was a result of something within the process of production, but I'm leaning closer towards it being intentional since the quick scene of Goldborn Chisa and the second floating above the city looks more like the standard style of this series. It was a bold decision to end the two major storylines of Dynazenon simultaneously in episode 10, rather than giving each its own dedicated episode and making sure to run these stories through to the end of the anime, but it's a decision that I think paid off as it opens up a lot of space for the following two episodes. Episode 11 is what I consider to be the best episode in Dynazenon, and 12 would be my vote for third, right behind 10 for second. It helps a lot that the writers seem to have had confidence in the pieces they laid out for themselves prior to this episode to only work off of those, instead of trying to add another dramatic element or have a twist ending. The way that Yume and Koyomi's stories close out are simple but effective, which really helps set this episode apart as the climax of the anime. I find myself having enjoyed Koyomi's story more than I did Yume's because there's something about the sheer simplicity of it, of how the entire journey was centered around self-reflection rather than revelations like Yume's did. Of course, while this should go without saying, just because I liked Koyomi's story more doesn't mean anything is detracted from Yume's. There isn't any grand epiphany or insight I have to offer about this episode. It was just done very well, so let's see how the aftermath of it plays out and how Dynazenon's story comes to an end. The extended, uninterrupted return to normalcy that runs for the first 16-17 minutes of episode 11 is all really good. It's essentially an unbroken stream of those calm between two storms quality of conversations that I love about the series, but standing out in its own unique way because of everyone finding ways to move on with their lives. Yomogi finally finds it in himself to confess to Yume, Koyomi begins the process of looking for a job, and Gauma is considering going elsewhere, although we never find out the destination if he even had one to begin with. Chise is uniquely impacted by the changes to Koyomi's life as she tries to return to a normal life despite her visibly not wanting to do so, and Knight and the second telling her that they need to take Goldburn with them is a cruel punchline to the entire experience. Koyomi's unchanging position in his own life acted as a sort of inspiration and or excuse for Chise to also put her life in a similar position, yet she's forced to change it since Koyomi is also doing so, but she doesn't have the same motivation that Koyomi does. I like the position that the anime puts Chise in during this episode and even the final one, because it manages to return to that idea of Chise being the outlier but in a new and interesting way. All of the kaiju eugenicists split up and go about their individual ways, with all of them displaying different methods of coping with the loss of kaijus. The eugenicists experience this kind of crash back down to reality since, according to them, the kaiju from episode 10 causing everyone to see their memories should have generated a lot of emotions which would have fueled the little kaiju cores, but not a single kaiju is to be seen after the incident, indicating that there are no more intact cores out there, and that the dream of a world for kaijus is now dead. This sort of extended return to normalcy is almost entirely unique to this episode through the entire series. One of the core fundamentals of the series is the constant back and forth between the quieter and mundane character-centric sequences and the intense, highly stylized action scenes featuring giant robots and kaijus. Returning to normalcy isn't anything new to the series by any means, but doing it to the extent that is seen in episode 11 of Dynazenon is a change to that fundamental aspect that isn't present anywhere else in the series. The closest I can think of would be in episode 10 of Gridman, where Akane hasn't left her house in a while after the failures of episode 9, leading to a lack of kaijus and therefore a slightly extended return to normalcy following the climax of the story. It's definitely the main reason as to why this episode stands out so much compared to everything else in Dynazenon, due to how uninterrupted a majority of it is. As was the case with Gridman, Dynazenon makes it a point to have everyone that never belonged in this world originally to end up leaving it. The primary difference is that Gridman waited until the very end of its final episode before having everyone say their goodbyes, whereas Dynazenon begins it prematurely by doing it an episode earlier. When combined with that return to normalcy that is so prevalent here, I think it reinforces the feeling that everything really is coming to a close and towards a finale. The series as a whole has very strong and definitive endings due to this nature of inevitable departure, and while I still prefer Gridman's ending overall, the way that Dynazenon slowly begins to wind down its story adds new things to it that weren't present in Gridman. Gauma dies in the following episode, and one of the key things emphasized in this episode is the gradual physical decline of Gauma's body, shown both in the way he moves and in the continuously spreading decay across his body. This is the first time in the entire series where an important protagonist is killed off. The closest we've had to this so far would be Tonkawa way back in the first episode of Gridman, but her importance to Gridman's story is completely dwarfed by Gauma's importance in Dynazenon's story. While the impact of his death is still significant, it's not so much of it being a tragic event that everyone is grieving over, but because it's the single event that confidently marks the end of Dynazenon's story. Everything that happens afterwards is more or less an epilogue where everyone isn't entering but has been in a new chapter of their lives for a while. Galma's death wasn't a huge surprise or twist for me because while the anime had been hinting at it for a little while by the time it happened, there is no great outburst of emotion from anybody over his death, since the anime presumably cuts it off before it could happen, and by the time we get back, it's like Galma's soul has already been put to rest. The story easing the viewer into Galma's eventual death is fundamental for his death to be perceived in such a way, and I really like the way that the anime handled it because of how it manages to reframe that epilogue sequence of Dynazenon. The reveal of Shizumu being the final true antagonist of Dynazenon is something that I had to really think about before I could make my mind up about it. In retrospect, it's built up slowly and steadily with how Shizumu constantly preaches all that philosophical kaiju nonsense and him going out of his way to be near Yume and Yomogi to leech off of their emotions to feed his inner kaiju. But something about this reveal feels very whelming to me. It's like an eventuality that clicked into place rather than a big shocking twist or some sort of grand reveal. And I think that this feelings comes from the fact that Dynazenon inevitably has to be compared to Gridman, and that it stems from the largest difference between the two installments, that Gridman had a much better villain than Dynazenon ever did. I've said it before, I've repeated it before, and I'm going to repeat myself again here. While the kaiju eugenicists are good characters, they are not good villains. Gridman invested so much time into building up Akane, and it does it very well, and in the process of doing so also builds up Alexis because of how closely linked those two characters are. Therefore, while the reveal of Alexis being the big bad villain in the final episode doesn't come as a surprise, him transforming Akane into a kaiju at the end of episode 11 still stands as a fantastic twist, because it's another way that the build-up invested into both of these characters climaxes, even if it may not be the climax of Gridman's story arc itself. But in Dynazenon, as I've said before, the eugenicists have always felt like an afterthought that's been tacked on to the back half of most of the episodes for the sake of creating a fight rather than being a meaningful antagonistic force with well-established motivations. Shizumu transforming into a kaiju doesn't really do anything to change this either, since the transformation is all that happens. Although the kaiju he transforms into is really fucking cool, it doesn't inspire any new perspectives onto the eugenicists, which sounds like a weird and stupidly nitpicky thing to say, I know, but when looking at it, it once again falls into that same sleek mechanical aesthetic that has dominated the kaiju designs of Dynazenon. Outside of the kaijus present in episodes 5 and 8, every other kaiju falls under that same aesthetic umbrella. I think you could even argue that the one in 8 also falls into this category and that only the one in 5 truly sticks out as a novel, unique design. The reason why I'm pointing out this issue of aesthetic consistency throughout Dynazenon is to really emphasize my point that this final villain of a kaiju doesn't feel all that special or unique compared to the rest of the anime. Now, Gridman has its fair share of sleek and mechanical designs too, so it might not be entirely fair of me to criticize Dynazenon for it, but not Gridman. Well, Gridman has a few things going on for it that makes me willing to overlook that kind of aesthetic consistency. Firstly, almost every single kaiju in Gridman is explicitly stated to be created by a single person, Akane, so it's understandable that there is that level of consistency to the designs. Alexis doesn't do anything to change these designs, he merely causes them to manifest. Secondly, even with the numerous mechanical designs in Gridman, there are still a number of designs that don't fall under that same exact category. The giant mountain kaiju of episode 5 is a clear example, and the kaiju in episode 1 doesn't really have the same sleek look to it, what with the various ridges and parts of it flaking off. The first form of Nanashi looks like it's been partially deflated, while the second form has a disturbingly organic look to it. The kaiju that Akane becomes has a very rugged and rocky outer shell, and the masks that take the spot of where the face should have been solidifies it as not necessarily my favorite, but as the most memorable design in the entire series for me, as I've said before. I'm not saying that these sleek and mechanical designs are bad or ugly, because they're absolutely not. I really like that kind of design as a matter of fact, but they can start feeling homogeneous after a while, and Shizumu's kaiju form definitely falls victim to this, turning it into a literally visible example as to why this reveal didn't impress me on my first time through, and it certainly didn't on my second time either. As a result of episode 12's fight, Galma and all of the kaiju eugenicists die. Just to cover the eugenicists quickly, they go out of this world as underwhelmingly as they came into it. The final episode doesn't do anything to change my perspective on them in a meaningful way. Shizumu's one-on-one talk with Yomogi is okay, but it really ends up being more of the same stuff from Shizumu. Yomogi's outlook on how he would rather live through the ups and downs of being human rather than freeing himself from the human shackles of time, space, and death is all interesting and helps set him as a more grounded counterpart to Shizumu, but that doesn't change anything about the eugenicists. I've already talked about Galma's death in decent length of how the anime eases the viewer into this moment as being the final conclusive moment in Dynazenon's story, with everything after this feeling like an epilogue, a feeling that is almost certainly present due to the 3 months later transition shot that pops up. But something I mentioned back then that I want to talk more about would be how Galma's death doesn't feel like a tragedy that everyone is grieving over. I think the epilogue sequence of Dynazenon does a good job at bringing everything to a satisfying close. It's nice to see that Yume and Yomogi did get together and something became of the two, given that there was a much larger focus on their relationship over the course of Dynazenon compared to the nearly non-existent one between Yuta and Erika back in Gridman. Yomogi himself has also seemed to come to terms with his own problems in regards to his family, with him accepting things for what they are. Koyomi managing to get a job after a long struggle is actually more nice to hear rather than him having worked somewhere for the last few months. Even after the personal growth he has experienced, life is still difficult, but he's making the best of what he can even if it isn't ideal. Chise still isn't back in school, but it's not because she's skipping it, but because her school got wrecked over the events of the final battle with the kaiju, and the same thing goes for her as it did with Koyomi. These are just nice, heartwarming scenes to end things on. It might not be quite the same melancholy, bittersweet ending of Gridman that I loved, but Dynazenon's ending is still perfectly great in its own regards. There's a clear theme of accepting your less than ideal circumstances and making the most of it, rather than letting yourself be weighed down by it during this epilogue, which is a nice contrast and finale to Dynazenon's overarching theme of a lack of closure. So, now we can go back to the whole bit about how Galma's death isn't portrayed as a tragedy. Firstly, as I said, the 3 months later time skip contributes a lot to this because it essentially skips past any of the mourning that would have happened in response to his death. Galma may have passed away and the world is still recovering from the damage left behind by the kaijus, but everyone is moving on with their lives in different ways even if things aren't as picture perfect as they would have hoped for it to be. Galma simply lives on in the memories and the scars of those he met. If it wasn't for Galma, Yume and Yomogi wouldn't be together, because they would have had no reason to consistently see one another. Chise and Koyomi would still be holed up in their rooms going nowhere. Yume would have never found closure in the truth about the death of her sister, and Koyomi would have never gotten the answer to his question of what if. Galma is the reason why so many of these stories were able to both begin and end, so even if he doesn't play a direct mainline role in the epilogue, his influence and impact serves as the foundation for it. There is just one thing though. I'm going to play a scene at the epilogue section here for 5 or so seconds to try and see if you notice anything. If you didn't notice anything weird here, then I don't blame you because I didn't notice it either through both of my viewings and only learned about it through some comments on the internet. On the left side of the screen, right underneath Yomogi's umbrella, is Galma. So what the fuck could this possibly mean when the anime has made it rather clear that Galma has died? Well, despite the weirdness of it and how much of a surprise it was when I first learned of this, it's one of the easiest things in the entire series to explain. Galma is now watching over the rest of the characters. You could very easily say that when Dynarex turns back and its eyes light up in the final shot of the anime, that Galma's spirit has moved on from its physical body and into a new mechanical one. It's ironic that the characters Galma is now watching over were able to find closure and come to terms with the endings to their stories when he himself was never able to find a meaningful end to his own. He never got to meet his princess, nor was he ever able to remember the final thing the princess said should always be kept. Promises, love, and we'll never know the third one. He manages to find the answer to why he was entrusted with Dynazenon, but it's something that isn't explicitly told to the viewer, so we can only guess. His recognition of the bittersweet nature of his story's ending is made apparent by how he laments not being able to see the princess again, but is still thankful for having been able to meet the people that he did. How Galma's story ends adds a gloomy undertone to the epilogue, one that is overshadowed but not understated. Thanks to the lack of his presence in this epilogue, Galma truly solidifies himself as the definitively most important character in all of SSSS.Dynazenon. My experience with Dynazenon really cemented the value of re-watching something for me. While my experience with re-watching Gridman caused me to go from feeling positive about it to extremely positive, my time with Dynazenon was a little more turbulent, as you could tell, and ultimately I think it's a good thing that it was as turbulent as it was. If Dynazenon was more similar to Gridman, then this experience probably would have been more steady. While I might have enjoyed it more my first time and my during the second wouldn't have changed a lot, my overall enjoyment of it would have been lesser than Dynazenon's current state. Some of those differences that created that sense of disappointment during my first time are what ended up setting Dynazenon apart from its predecessor in a special way that made my second time going through it so much more magical. It was wrong of me to expect more of the same going into Dynazenon, and I'm incredibly happy to have been proven wrong. I know I've said this about Gridman earlier on in the video, but in reality it extends out to the entire series. It genuinely blows my fucking mind whenever I'm reminded of this series because of how impressive it was in so many aspects. I'm sure, or at least I hope, that this video stands as evidence to support that I really do mean it when I say that. I'm sure that there's going to be people watching this video that don't agree with the things I've said or think that I'm seeing details that aren't even there. And that's okay. The point of this video wasn't to persuade anyone that the Gridman universe is the best animated series to have ever graced this timeline. It was simply to put every single thought I've ever had about the series out there, and in that respect, I'm pretty happy with how this video turned out. The next installment of the Gridman universe has already been announced, which is a movie very subtly titled Gridman x Dynazenon. During the time of writing this script, there haven't been any details announced, but I'm sure there will be something that gets dropped during the editing process. And if I'm being really honest here, I don't really care about those announcements. After having seen both Gridman and Dynazenon, I have full faith in both Suburaya and Trigger to create something that is equally as incredible. I'll just be watching it whenever it officially airs, and I feel confident that I'll be enjoying it a lot. Maybe I'll be eating my words in the future, but I highly doubt it. In any case that I do, I'm sure it'll at least make for an interesting video. SSSS.Gridman was a truly outstanding experience, and SSSS.Dynazenon is a sequel that replicates the strengths of its predecessor in both familiar yet new and unique ways. I can only hope that I was able to illustrate my feelings for the series to you through this commentary on the Gridman universe, my favorite animated series. Alright. Hello and welcome to the outro part of this video, but before we actually get to the outro part of the video, there's just one thing that we need to do real fast. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. Every single like and subscribe means a whole lot to a channel as small as mine. Now that that's out of the way, hello and welcome to the outro part of this video. This part of the video will just be a few things I couldn't fit into the main video, as well as covering some upcoming stuff for the channel. I'm mostly happy with the Gridman half of the video, but the Dynazenon half is lacking a lot of polish. It doesn't feel incomplete or half-baked, but more like 2/3 or 3/4 baked. This is most certainly a product of me having more time to think over Gridman than I did for Dynazenon, but also because work for the Dynazenon parts was rushed, especially in the recording department, so a lot of mistakes were made, but also had to be kept in because by the time that I got to the Dynazenon part of editing, going back to re-record those parts and trying to edit them back in without it sounding like a completely different recording would be too time-consuming with my level of expertise, or rather the lack of. The conclusions for the video are all terrible. I've never been great at writing conclusions, but by God, editing those conclusions made me realize just how not super good they are. These are maybe up there as some of the worst conclusions I've ever written, but I don't think anything will ever top the terrible One Punch Man video I made a long time ago. So apologies on that one. Apologies about the conclusions, that is not the One Punch Man video. The audio is a little all over the place. I don't know how noticeable it is for people listening to it on YouTube, but it was noticeable enough for me while editing it to call it out here. The audio does sound different for editing compared to the final product, so maybe it's not as pronounced on the final product as I think it might be. Going to some positive things, music in the series is great. Both of the openings are good, but both of the endings are outstanding, especially the Gridman one. I fucking love the Gridman ending so much, like, holy shit, that Gridman ending is so good. I talked a lot about episode 9, but one thing I never really touched upon was the visuals of it. It shares the same rougher general look of Dynazenon's 10, but pulls it off better in my opinion because of the context. I might make an entirely separate video far into the future looking at just the visuals of episode 9. Going away from this video and moving on to some other videos that will be happening, first of all, let's talk about the Shadows House video that I uploaded sometime in January. That video was just all white text on a black background. I'm probably going to re-upload all copyright striked content in the future in that same manner, but in a slightly more visually appealing way, if I can think of a way to do so. There's also a chance I straight up upload a video like that if there's an anime that I really want to talk but think that there might be a high chance of it getting striked. This is mostly dependent on which studios are involved with the anime, as I've noticed that some studios are a little more trigger happy when it comes to copyright strikes and claims, so that's just something to look out for in the future. The next video might be Odd Taxi. There's a few things that I need to look into before I can confidently begin working on it, but it's looking pretty likely to happen. Regardless of whether or not the Odd Taxi video happens, there will be a Zombieland Saga Revenge video after it. It won't be like this one where I cover both the original and the new. There will be a lot of discussion surrounding the first season for sure, but it'll almost exclusively be in regards to comparison and not as a standalone piece of analysis. It's still going to be a sizable video, but definitely nowhere near as big as this one. Depending on how big that ends up becoming, there might be another video that happens between it and Odd Taxi, but that's a little too far into the future to say with any level of confidence. And I think that's about it for the outro. It's a little long, but then again, long is subjective, especially when you slap it on the end of a 3-hour-long video, I guess. So yeah, that's going to be everything from me. Once again, thank you for watching this video, especially if you stuck around this long up to this point, hearing me just go on and on about big fucking robots and big dinosaurs. So I appreciate that you took the time a lot, like genuinely, no jokes. It was a lot of work to put together this video, and it really means a lot that you stuck around this long to actually listen to me say this part of the video as well. I hope the Odd Taxi video won't take it too long to make, and regular, I say in enormous air quotes, uploads should be coming back to the channel. I hope. That really depends on some other factors, but I hope. Okay, that's actually it from me now. Again, for the umpteenth time, thank you for watching. Have a nice day, and please, take it easy.